Chapter 4290. Li Yuan was a little confused. He never thought that he would swear loyalty to Kenshin as soon as he arrived at illusory sun-blessed land. Before he could express his loyalty and intimacy to Kenshin, Kenshin wanted to drive him away. Wasn't this too fast? What did he do wrong? What did he do wrong? How could he make Kenshin hate him so much that he wanted to drive him away? Li Yuan was stunned. His expression was a little embarrassed, and his eyes revealed anxiety and helplessness. Although the illusory sun sect master knew the reason, he quickly gave Li Yuan a look to calm down and not to worry about it. Unfortunately, Li Yuan was a reckless person. He couldn't even read the illusory sun sect master's eyes. He stammered and wanted to plead with Ji Tianxing. Seeing Li Yuan's reaction, Ji Tianxing knew that he misunderstood. He explained, "Now that I'm in illusory sun-blessed land, the news has spread all over the firmament land. The Celestial King didn't dare to bring troops to besiege me, so he targeted the four forces hoping to regain his face. At this time, I'm afraid that the elite troops sent by the Celestial King are on their way to the Li tribe. Why don't you go back to take charge of the situation? Why are you still here?" Facing a simple-minded person like Li Yuan, Ji Tianxing couldn't be secretive. He didn't want Li Yuan to misunderstand and cause more misunderstandings. He patiently explained a few words and Li Yuan suddenly understood. He was suddenly full of worry and anxiety. This time, even without the illusory sun sect master's persuasion, Li Yuan didn't want to stay. He quickly bowed to Ji Tianxing and left. "Your Excellency's great foresight is really admirable. I don't want to waste any more time. I'll go back to the Li tribe and resist the Celestial King's dogs with all my strength." "Go." Ji Tianxing waved his hand and sent him away. Li Yuan was really swift and decisive. After leaving the study, he quickly found the two elders and took them out of illusory sun-blessed land. As soon as they got out of illusory sun-blessed land, the two elders were still confused and kept asking him what had happened. Li Yuan didn't answer. He first took out a communication jade slip and sent a message to the elders guarding the cave mansion, asking them to immediately close the entrance of the cave mansion to prevent a sneak attack. In addition, he also told the elders that the Celestial King might send elite troops to launch a sneak attack, so all the disciples of the clan should be on high alert. After giving these instructions, Li Yuan explained to the two elders beside him why he had hurried back. When the two elders arrived at illusory sun-blessed land, they didn't even see Kenshin's face before they had to return. Naturally, they were filled with disappointment and regret. However, after hearing Li Yuan's explanation and knowing the reason, they felt relieved. At the same time, they felt more and more admiration for Kenshin's divine foresight. Only Ji Tianxing and the illusory sun sect master were left in the study. The illusory sun sect master hesitated for a moment before tentatively asking, "Sir, should this subordinate send a message to the three patriarchs, sect master and pavilion master, and tell them about this matter?" In his opinion, since Kenshin had guessed that the Celestial King would send elite troops to attack the four forces, it was necessary to inform the four patriarchs and sect masters. Li Yuan already knew, but the other three patriarchs, sect master and pavilion master, were still in the dark. The illusory sun sect master thought that he should inform the three patriarchs, sect master and pavilion master as soon as possible so that they could take precautions in case the Celestial King succeeded. However, he was also worried that the three of them would immediately turn back after hearing that their base was being attacked. That would be too embarrassing. Therefore, after hesitating and weighing the pros and cons for a while, he asked Ji Tianxing for instructions. Ji Tianxing already had an answer, so he nodded without hesitation and said, "I'll leave this matter to you. Go ahead." The illusory sun sect master secretly sighed in relief and hurriedly acknowledged the order, bowed and left the study. He went to send a message to the three patriarchs, sect master and pavilion master. Ji Tianxing also left the study and returned to the secret room to continue cultivating. During this period of time, he had already refined the quintessence fragments of General Nan Feng and the numerous God King experts in the distorted spacetime of Jutian 10 Absolute's tower. His strength was still steadily increasing and had already reached 51 times that of an ordinary peak God King. Unfortunately, the 5 God Emperors had yet to appear, and it was impossible for them to face him head-on in the short term. Therefore, he was still unable to verify his strength and realm, and how much of a gap there was between him and the 5 God Emperors. Or perhaps, was there still a gap? Yun Yao and Ji Wuhan were naturally not in the house. They had already returned to the distorted spacetime to cultivate in seclusion. In fact, Xianxia was the only one living in the house. This was also the reason why the sixth elder was puzzled as to why the Kenshin couple had not made a move for the past few days. On the other hand, Patriarch Feng Sun, Sect Master Yan Guang, and Pavilion Master Shifeng had been rushing with all their might. They were not far from illusory sun-blessed land. They were filled with excitement and anticipation. They only wanted to reach illusory sun-blessed land as soon as possible and pledge their loyalty to Kenshin in person. In order to wait for the arrival of this day, they had endured for a long time and were on tenterhooks for several months. Now that their backer had finally arrived, their days of suffering would also be over. They were about to follow Kenshin to conquer the firmament mainland and usher in glory. However, just as the three experts were filled with fantasies, they suddenly received a message from Illusory Sun Sect Master. When they finished reading the message, they were stunned by the sudden bad news and felt uneasy. Empyrean God King had actually dispatched elite troops to attack their lair. Although they did not receive any information or clues, this was the result of Kenshin's speculation. They believed it without a doubt. As soon as they received the news, the three experts had the urge to turn around and return. They only wanted to go back and set up a defense against the Celestial King's lackeys as soon as possible. However, their rationality kept them calm and dispelled this idea. Not to mention that they had been rushing for several days and were finally about to reach illusory sun-blessed land. If they turned back now, they would not accomplish anything and would be wasting time. Most importantly, Kenshin was waiting for them in illusory sun-blessed land. If they turned around and left Kenshin in illusory sun-blessed land, how could they face Kenshin in the future? With Kenshin's ruthless, overbearing and iron-blooded nature, they would not be able to get away with it easily. They were already like fire and water with Celestial King. They could not exist under the same sky. If they offended Kenshin again, they would not be able to please either side and could only wait for their deaths. After weighing the pros and cons, the three sect masters, Patriarch and Pavilion Master made the same decision without any further discussion. That was, to continue to rush to illusory sun-blessed land. At the same time, they all sent a message back and ordered their disciples to close the entrance of the cave and guard against any sneak attacks by Celestial King's subordinates. After the protectors and elders of the three forces received the message and immediately began to act, the three patriarchs, sect masters and pavilion master were slightly relieved and continued their journey. End of chapter. Chapter 4291. After the illusory sun sect master sent the message to the three leaders, he had been in a state of anxiety. He knew that Lord Kenshin was a broad-minded person, so he wouldn't care too much. In fact, even if the people in charge of the three forces were really confused enough to turn around and return, the God of Swords would probably not be angry. But one thing was for sure, they would leave a bad impression on Kenshin. As a friend of many years and as a colleague in the future, the illusory sun sect master didn't want the leaders of the three forces to be confused at this critical moment. Although he was a little selfish, he wasn't selfish. He had a big picture view. He knew that the most important thing now was to expand the forces under Kenshin, and the more forces that pledged their loyalty, the better. As long as Kenshin's forces grew stronger, they would be safer and have a better chance of conquering the entire firmament mainland. So he sincerely hoped that there wouldn't be any changes in this matter. Fortunately, Feng Sun, Yan Guang and Shifeng Pavilion Master were all clear-headed and made the right choice. They all sent messages back to the illusory sun sect master, thanking him for the reminder and saying that they would continue to rush to illusory sun-blessed land. Also, they asked the illusory sun sect master to send their greetings to Kenshin and said that they would rush there as soon as possible. It was just some nonsense that didn't seem to be useful. But it was their attitude to show their determination to Kenshin. 4 days passed in a flash. On the morning of the 5th day, Feng Sun entered illusory sun-blessed land. As usual, the illusory sun sect master received him personally and led him to see Xianxia. Now that the situation was critical, everyone knew that Kenshin wouldn't wait for the three leaders to arrive and pledge their loyalty together. Whoever arrived at the illusory sun-blessed land first would be brought over by the illusory sun sect master to swear allegiance to the sword god. The process was short. From Feng Sun Mie entering illusory sun-blessed land to seeing Kenshin, pledging his loyalty and leaving, it only took half an hour. After the heavenly oath was made, Feng Sun Mie felt relieved. After leaving illusory sun-blessed land, he brought the elders with him and rushed back as fast as possible. In the evening, Shifeng Pavilion Master also arrived at illusory sun-blessed land. Just like Feng Sunmie, he was led by the illusory Sun Clan Master to meet the Kenshin. After swearing his loyalty, he left in a hurry. After a night, on the morning of the 6th day, Sect Master Yan Guang finally arrived. The previous scene played out again with the same procedure and speed. Before they came, Feng Sunmi Shifeng Pavilion Master and Yanguang Sect Master had already thought about how to get close to Kenshin and how to show their loyalty and talent. But in this situation they couldn't care less about showing off themselves. They could only focus on the big picture. Since they were already Kenshin's subordinates, there would be plenty of time for them to interact and perform. Of course, when the three experts left, they still harbored a trace of hope and expectation in their hearts. They were worried about their gains and losses. They were all thinking, what if they could not withstand the elite troops sent by the Celestial King with their own strength? Will Sama just sit back and do nothing? If Lord Kenshin wanted to help, he would have to rescue the four forces scattered across the firmament land. No matter how powerful Kenshin was, he wouldn't be able to split himself up. But if Kenshin didn't help, they would be killed by the Celestial King's subordinates. Wouldn't that be too unjust? With such a feeling of anxiety, the four clan masters went back home. At the same time, in the illusory sun-blessed land, the illusory Sun Clan Master was summoned by Ji Tianxing and went to his study room to meet him. After saluting, the illusory Sun Clan Master asked, "Sir, what can I do for you?" Ji Tianxing sat in the armchair with an ancient scroll in his hand. He looked thoughtful and said calmly, "Now that the situation in the firmament land has become chaotic, the battle between me and the Celestial King has officially begun." But he turned a blind eye to the chaos in the four regions and had no intention of sending troops to help. His idea was clear. He wanted to concentrate his forces and defend the heaven capital. At the same time, he wanted to find an opportunity to send out elite troops to destroy my forces. The hundreds of millions of people in the firmament land and many top forces and ancient clans are watching our every move. The next development of the situation will affect their choice. So, the Li clan, the Fengshuan clan, the Yanguang sect and the Shifeng Pavilion can't be lost. The illusory Sun Clan Master was smart and understood what he meant. "Sir, do you mean that we have to support the four forces to fight against the army sent by the Celestial King? If so, I'm willing to lead the disciples of the illusory Sun Clan to follow your orders." Ji Tianxing waved his hand and said, "The illusory Sun Clan just went through a big battle. The disciples need to rest and recover their strength. It's not suitable for them to go out in the short term. I have to deal with the army sent by the Celestial King to achieve a shocking effect. Of course, you don't have to worry that the Celestial King will send another army to attack the illusory sun-blessed land after I leave. I'll leave a doppelganger here. I think the Celestial King won't dare to invade." The illusory Sun Clan Master had thought about this problem before. With his intelligence, he had already guessed that Kenshin would personally take action. At that time, he was worried that if Kenshin left the illusory sun-blessed land, the Celestial King would most likely send an army to attack. After all, the Celestial King had enough experts and soldiers under his command. He could divide his forces and find an opportunity to attack. However, he worried too much. Kenshin had already considered this possibility and thought of a solution. Indeed, as long as Kenshin left a doppelganger here and showed up at the right time, the Celestial King would misjudge the situation. When the real Kenshin helped the four forces fight against the enemy, the Celestial King would see through Kenshin's scheme. But by then it would be too late. Moreover, the Celestial King might not have the courage to lead an army to attack Kenshin's doppelganger. "My lord, you're so thoughtful and meticulous. I'm impressed." The illusory Sun Clan Master bowed and said sincerely, "But I still have a question. I have to ask my lord to enlighten me. The Li clan, Fengshuan clan, Yanguang sect and Shifeng Pavilion are far away from each other. They are scattered all over the continent. Even if you personally take action, you won't be able to split yourself and save the four forces in time." Ji Tianxing smiled playfully and said, "Since I can leave a doppelganger here, I can send more doppelganger to save the four forces at the same time." The illusory Sun Clan Master's body shook, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. In the knowledge of all God Kings, the main body and doppelganger could not be too far apart. If they were more than 100 million miles apart, it would be difficult to control the doppelganger, not to mention the doppelganger's combat power. However, Kenshin's words meant that he could control several doppelganger at the same time from a few billion miles away. It was unbelievable. Chapter 4292. The more time he spent with Kenshin, the more the illusory Sun Sect Master was unable to see through the other party's realm, cultivation, and methods. While he was still in shock, Ji Tianqing ordered, "Also, there's one more thing I need you to do. As for the secluded and neutral factions and ancient clans, I asked you to compile a list of names and information on them. Have you finished it?" The illusory Sun Sect Master came back to his senses and replied with an awkward expression, "Reporting to my lord, it's already 90% done. There's still about 10% left and it'll be done by tomorrow at the latest." Ji Tianqing didn't criticize him and nodded slightly. "Send the list over after you're done, and then send out invitations to those factions in your own name. Let them understand my intentions and attitude, and do your best to persuade them to join the Rebel Alliance and participate in this grand undertaking. Whether it's coercion, bribery, or swindling, you can do it to your heart's content." In short, Ji Tianqing wanted the illusory Sun Sect Master to recruit and persuade more people to join him as soon as possible. However, those coercion and swindling methods were only suitable for the illusory Sun Sect Master to use. He definitely couldn't use them. It was too degrading. The illusory Sun Sect Master understood Ji Tianqing's meaning, but he couldn't go along with it. He said with a smile, "Rest assured, my lord, this subordinate knows what to do. Moreover, the leaders of those clans and factions all revere and worship you. It's just that due to many reasons they can't contact you for the time being and can't pledge their loyalty to you. As long as this subordinate sends them a message and invites them, there's no need to use coercion or bribery at all. They'll rush to pledge their loyalty to you." The illusory Sun Sect Master's words were very beautiful, and Ji Tianqing was very pleased. Although the two of them knew that these words were mostly true and that it wasn't that simple to subdue those clans and factions. However, this didn't affect a capable minister who was good at flattery, and said the right words at the right time. "Go." Ji Tianqing waved his hand and had the illusory Sun Sect Master withdraw. Then he used the 10-direction vanishing shadows and created 4 doppelgangers. One of the doppelgangers stayed in the house and meditated in a secret room. His original body and the other 3 doppelgangers quietly left illusory Sun Paradise and rushed to the 4 factions. Before leaving, Ji Tianqing had a route map in his mind. With Empyrean God King's Tiandu as the center, there would be 4 different routes to send troops to the Li clan, Fengsun clan, and the other 2 clans. Among the 4 routes, the shortest distance to the 10 Pavilion was the furthest was to the 10 Pavilion. In other words, Empyrean God King's troops would take several days to arrive at the 4 factions. There was a distance 10-direction vanishing shadow Sun Sect pavilions to the 10 to sect to the 4 factions to several days. After analyzing and weighing the pros and cons, he made a decision. 10's 10 sects 2's to the 10 to the clans to the clans. His original body would take the deity-slaying battleship and rush to the 10-direction pavilion. If the Celestial King's troops attacked the moment they arrived at the destination. With this arrangement, his 3 doppelgangers would be able to arrive before the 2 sides fought, or even during the battle, and provide support. The 10-direction pavilion was an exception. If he sent his doppelgangers to provide support, the 10-direction pavilion would have been destroyed by the Celestial King's troops by the time his doppelgangers arrived. That was why his original body would go there personally. The White Dragon drove the deity-slaying battleship at twice the speed of light, consuming tens of millions of resources every hour. Carried Ji Tianqing to the 10-direction pavilion. If his doppelgangers went there, it would take at least 7 days. But the deity-slaying battleship only needed 2 days to arrive. Even though Ji Tianqing was able to predict Empyrean God King's plans with incredible foresight, Empyrean God King's plans were still a mystery to him. But he was not omnipotent. His plans and arrangements were for the 4 armies to attack as soon as they arrived at their target. But in reality, the troops led by the 8 celestial generals arrived at the destination one after another, but they did not start the battle immediately. They kept in mind the Celestial King's instructions and tried their best to find an opportunity to launch a sneak attack using conspiracies. They wanted to destroy the target as quickly as possible at the lowest cost. 2 days later, Ji Tianqing arrived at the most remote 10-direction pavilion on the deity-slaying battleship. Interestingly, the 10-direction pavilion master was still on his way back. Conservatively speaking, he would only be back in about 9 days. At this time, the 2 celestial generals under the Celestial King led 30 celestial kings and 9,000 Sir God Masters to arrive at the 10-direction pavilion on 3 deity ships. The fleet stopped outside the entrance of the 10-direction pavilion, hid their tracks and auras and lay in wait quietly. The 2 celestial generals sent out a dozen celestial kings and a large number of scouts to investigate the situation at the 10-direction pavilion, preparing to carry out a conspiracy. Xianxia put away the deity-slaying battleship and remained invisible. After circling around the area, he easily saw through the fleet's disguise. Seeing that the other side did not move, he was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he observed the situation in the dark. On the 3rd day, Xianxia's 2 doppelgangers arrived at the abodes of the Li clan and the Feng Sun clan. At this time, the 2 troops sent by the Celestial King were still half a day away from arriving. Xianxia's doppelgangers arrived before them. Of course, Li Yuan and Feng Sunmi were still on their way back. They would arrive in about 3 days. On the 4th day, Xianxia's 3rd doppelganger finally arrived at the Yanguang sect. At the same time, the 2 celestial generals in charge of attacking the Yanguang sect arrived with 9,000 troops. The current situation was very delicate. Except for the forces under Xianxia and the experts under the Celestial King, no one knew that a terrible war was about to break out on the seemingly peaceful firmament land. After the 4 troops arrived at their destination, they did not move and silently waited for an opportunity. Xianxia and his 3 doppelgangers were also very patient. They were waiting to see what tricks the other side was up to. The clan leaders, suzerains and pavilion masters of the 4 forces were still in the dark. They hurried on with anxious hearts. In order to not expose his whereabouts and plan, Xianxia did not tell the clan leaders and suzerains that he and his doppelgangers had arrived. He wanted to strike at the right time and give the 4 troops a heavy blow. Only then could he shock the world. The Celestial King stayed in Heaven Capital and remotely controlled the 4 troops through intelligence and communication. He also monitored the situation in the illusionary sun-blessed land. Up until now, the Celestial King still thought that Xianxia was still in the illusionary sun-blessed land and did not know his plan and conspiracy. Because just yesterday, scouts and spies sent news that Xianxia was still in the illusionary sun-blessed land and was explaining to several young immortal kings. When he heard the news, the Celestial King sneered and sneered. In his opinion, Xianxia was too arrogant and complacent. He wanted to win people's hearts but did not know that a disaster was coming. Chapter 4293. Xianxia, who was guarding illusory sun-blessed land, was naturally Xianxia's avatar. The so-called explanation to the young divine kings was nothing more than a smokescreen set up by Xianxia and illusory sun sect master to show their faces in front of everyone. And within illusory sun sect, there must be spies and insiders sent by the Celestial King. This was something that both Xianxia and illusory sun sect master knew. The reason why illusory sun sect master was not in a hurry to get rid of the spies was because he wanted to wait for the spies to pass the news that Xianxia was still in illusory sun-blessed land to the Celestial King. One day later, he secretly ordered a few elders to start screening and investigating, vowing to find the spies of the Celestial King. At this time, the 4 armies dispatched by Empyrean God King had rested for a day, investigated the situation of the 4 factions, and then began their assault. The first army to attack was ordered to attack the Li tribe's cave dwelling. No one knew what methods they used or what information they received, but they actually found out that Li Yuan was not in the Li tribe's cave dwelling. Since the Li tribe's leader was not there, it was the best time for them to attack. Even though the Li tribe's cave dwelling was tightly shut, and the defensive formation was strengthened, this army was not afraid. 3 divine warships arranged themselves in a formation and fired their cannons first, blasting out hundreds of dazzling divine power light pillars. Immediately after, 2 divine craftsmen led 30 divine king generals and 9,000 elite divine monarchs to attack without any regard for their own safety. They used all their strength to attack the entrance of the Li tribe's cave dwelling with all their might, vowing to break through the cave dwelling in the shortest time possible. However, the Li tribe elders, deacons and disciples in the cave dwelling were already prepared. Thousands of disciples gathered at the entrance of the cave dwelling, forming a battle formation and casting spells to increase the power of the defensive formation. Even though the enemy's attack was fierce, the cannon fire was extremely intense. The defensive formation of the Li tribe's cave dwelling was bombarded until it flashed with divine light and overflowed with energy. There were even cracks. But with the support of the Li tribe disciples, the defensive formation did not fall, and the cracks were quickly repaired. The 9,000 troops led by the two divine generals had been attacking for 2 hours, expending a lot of energy and divine power, and their battle power was greatly reduced. But the defensive formation of the Li tribe's cave dwelling was still intact, and the cracks that had appeared were all repaired. Apart from the defensive formation's energy being depleted, nothing else had changed. This result made the two divine blacksmiths and the 9,000 soldiers feel very uncomfortable, and they felt great pressure. Divine king generals, cursing angrily. Those damned lowly Li clan people, they must have received the news long ago, so they are all hiding in their caves. Our whereabouts are very well hidden. Just based on the Li tribe's intelligence network, it is impossible for them to discover us. Who leaked our whereabouts? Sun's cave dwellings is. Our whereabouts and plans have been exposed. If we delay for another day or two, I'm afraid that there will be more variables. To see if lords ofs. Originally they were here to ambush the Li tribe. If the Li tribe had not sensed the danger, the cave dwelling's entrance would still be open, and there would be 100 guards guarding it. These divine king generals with 9,000 divine monarchs would be able to easily break into the Li tribe's cave dwelling. But the Li tribe had holed themselves up in the cave dwelling, relying on the defensive formation. This was a headache. The divine king generals went to consult the two divine generals, and everyone discussed a plan. The 9,000 divine monarchs were still attacking and they did not dare to stop. But at this moment Ji Tianxing, who had been hiding in the dark, finally made his move. Sword rain. He who was invisible quietly entered the formation of the 9,000 troops, and used his trump card. Following his shout, tens of thousands of stars appeared in the sky, and they poured down like a meteor shower. The 9,000 troops that were busy attacking the Li tribe's cave dwelling suddenly felt something was wrong, and they subconsciously looked up at the sky. The 30 divine king generals and the 2 divine generals also looked up at the sky. Everyone then saw clearly that it was not a meteor shower, but 90,000 starry swords. Each starry sword was 10,000 feet long, and they carried a terrifying sword intent that could destroy everything, and they instantly fell on top of their heads. Danger! Dodge! At this moment of life and death, the 2 divine generals shouted, instructing the soldiers to dodge the starry swords. But unfortunately the 9,000 troops were too weak, and their reaction was not fast enough. Before the starry swords could touch them, they were suppressed by the invisible sword intent and power, and they could not move at all. Even if some people struggled with all their might, they could barely escape a few dozen miles away, but their speed was too slow. In the next moment, under the horrified and despairing expressions of the army of 90,000 star swords poured down and drowned an area of 20,000 miles in radius. Boom, 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 boom. There was an earth-shattering explosion. An area of 20,000 miles was turned into an endless sea of starlight, and billions of divine light shards burst out. Countless Sir-God experts were smashed into pieces after being hit by the starry swords, and blood and flesh splattered everywhere. Even the lower and middle divine king generals were mercilessly killed by the starry swords. A few of them died on the spot, but most of them were severely injured and they were howling miserably. Only the 2 divine generals of the upper divine king realm were able to dodge in time, and they escaped to the edge of the sword light. The 2 of them tried their best and they used all their trump cards and divine weapons to block the starry swords. In this way the 2 of them blocked most of the starry swords, and they were only hit by a dozen starry swords, and their injuries were not serious. In the blink of an eye, the first round of the 90,000 starry swords ended. 30,000 starry swords collapsed, and they turned into a torrent of starlight that dissipated between heaven and earth. The remaining 60,000 starry swords intertwined into a sword formation of 20,000 miles, and they were desperately killing the enemy in the formation. The 9,000 soldiers suffered heavy casualties, and more than 3,000 of them lost their lives in the first round of attack. The remaining 5,000 soldiers did not even have time to react before they were killed by the starry swords, and they screamed miserably again. 6 out of the 30 divine king realm generals were killed as well. The remaining 24 were either lightly or severely injured. Seeing the heavy casualties of the army, they were filled with grief and anger, and their hearts were filled with anger. It was a pity that they could not even protect themselves, and they did not have the time to help the dying army. As for the two divine craftsmen, they had escaped from the sword formation at the cost of their bodies being covered with wounds. Seeing the soldiers under their command being slaughtered in the sword formation, they were so angry that their eyes almost popped out of their sockets, but there was nothing they could do. Chapter 4294. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Tens of thousands of starry giant swords formed a sword array that lasted for 5 breaths of time before it ran out of energy and dissipated. When the stars in the sky dissipated and the battlefield regained its clarity, more than half of the 9,000 soldiers had died. More than 5,000 people died tragically in the sword array. They were smashed into pieces by the starry giant swords and died without a complete corpse. More than 1,000 people were severely injured. They were either covered in blood or had lost their limbs. They could barely fight anymore. Only 2,000 lucky Divine Lord experts had suffered light injuries. Although they looked to be in a sorry state, they could still continue fighting. As for the 30 King God Realm generals, 12 of them were killed by the sword array. 11 of them were severely injured. Only 7 of them were lightly injured. Seeing such a tragic ending, the 2 immortal generals almost couldn't believe their eyes. They were a little stunned. They really couldn't imagine who could perform such a terrifying divine ability and defeat their army in such a short time, causing them to suffer heavy casualties. Could it be the Li tribe who set up the array in advance? No. The 2 divine generals were sure that they did not trigger any array. Moreover, the appearance of the 90,000 starry giant swords was strange and sudden. There was no sign at all. After analyzing it, they were sure that it was a superpower and not a divine array. That was the problem. Just how terrifyingly strong was this expert to be able to display such a heaven-defying divine ability? Even a peak divine king could not do it. When this thought flashed through their minds, the 2 divine generals looked at each other and came up with the same idea at the same time. Their faces were filled with horror. In the current firmament land, perhaps only the sword god had such extraordinary strength and means. Thinking that it was Kenshin who did it, the 2 divine generals trembled. Fear surged in their hearts. However, they immediately calmed down and eliminated this thought. No, it can't be Kenshin. Kenshin was still in Illusory Sun Paradise yesterday. How could he be here? Since they eliminated the possibility of Kenshin, the 2 divine generals had new doubts. Besides Kenshin, who else would help the Li tribe and have such superpower? The 2 divine generals were still deep in thought. The 18 surviving divine kings and 3,000 soldiers retreated to the edge of the ruins. It was impossible to attack the Li tribe's cave abode. With their defeated army, it was impossible to break the Li tribe's defensive array. Moreover, even if they broke the array and entered the Li tribe's cave abode, they might not be able to defeat the thousands of Li tribe disciples. The most important thing was to retreat and recover. However, the heaven-destroying sword formation was only the beginning of the massacre. Just as the 3 divine generals retreated, a few sword rays of light suddenly in the sky and slashed towards the 3 divine ships. Of the 3 divine generals, swish! 9 dazzling golden swords streaked across the sky like bolts of lightning and instantly struck the 3 divine warships. Even though the 3 divine warships had been on guard for a long time and were on high alert. However, they were inanimate objects after all. They needed someone to control them, so it was impossible for them to have the reaction speed of a God King expert. The person operating the divine warship sensed the incoming sword light, but it was too late for him to dodge. Swish, swish, swish. The 3 godly warships were cut in half at the waist. Countless pieces of metal splashed out and were swept away in all directions by the violent airwaves. Thud. Boom. Amidst the deafening noise, the 2 halves of the divine warships fell from the sky and crashed into the ruins, splashing up yellow dust all over the sky. The 3 divine ships were destroyed just like that. The dozens of Sir God experts in charge of controlling the divine ships were either dead or injured. The 3,000 soldiers who were retreating were stunned. They stared at this scene with their mouths agape. An indescribable fear rose in their hearts. They had suffered such heavy casualties. Even the divine ship was destroyed. They had lost their means of escape. Yet they did not even know who had attacked. Panic spread and spread. The 3,000 soldiers could not help but scream and scream. They sped up and fled into the distance. Without a divine ship to ride, they would rather fly. They had to leave this terrifying place as soon as possible. The 3,000 soldiers were in chaos. They fled in all directions in panic. The two divine generals hurriedly shouted and ordered everyone to stop. Unfortunately, only a portion of the soldiers obeyed. They stopped anxiously and waited for the two divine generals' orders. The other half of the soldiers were already panicking and out of their wits. They ignored the two divine generals' orders and fled into the distance with all their might. They dove into the sea of clouds. Don't panic. Immediately get into formation and face the enemy. Stay alert. The enemy is lying in ambush. We cannot panic. Otherwise, if we give the enemy an opportunity, our casualties will increase. The two divine generals ordered the remaining 1,000 soldiers to quickly get into formation. They searched the surroundings cautiously for traces of the attacker. However, they spread out their divine senses and searched a radius of 70,000 miles. They did not find anything out of the ordinary. The two divine generals found the situation increasingly strange. They led the soldiers and retreated into the distance at a moderate pace. However, thousands of golden sword lights lit up in the sky and fell down like a heavy downpour. Swish, 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 swish. More than 9,000 golden sword lights descended and immediately formed a sword formation that covered a radius of 10,000 miles. It enveloped the 1,000 soldiers. The two divine generals and the soldiers were shocked. They thought the golden sword lights would kill them too. But in reality, the sword lights were only used to form a sword formation to seal them. They did not kill them. Swish. Just as everyone was filled with fear and panic, a handsome and valiant figure appeared in the sky above their heads. It was a young man in a white robe. He had an extraordinary demeanor and exuded a domineering aura that looked down on the world. Immediately, everyone's eyes gathered on him. After seeing his appearance clearly, everyone's bodies stiffened, and their expressions became extremely unsightly, revealing dense fear and despair in their eyes. Kenshin. He's Kenshin. Kenshin attacked us. No wonder. This is impossible. Kenshin is clearly in illusory sun-blessed land. How could he appear here? This must be an illusion. Don't be scared. Although the other party was alone, they had more than 1,000 soldiers on their side. But the other party was Kenshin. He was a supreme elite who could block 1,000,000 soldiers with a single sword strike. Therefore, the two divine generals and more than 1,000 soldiers were so scared that their faces turned pale and their hearts were filled with fear. Of course, many divine kings were able to remain calm despite their fear. They hurriedly sent out communication jade slips to inform the celestial king. It seemed that it was a foregone conclusion that they would be killed by Kenshin. However, if they could spread the news that Kenshin had saved the Li tribe, their deaths would be worth it. Chapter 4295. However, many god kings fearlessly sent out transmission jade slips, only to discover that the jade slips could not break the seal, let alone send out a message. The two god generals took out their special transmission jade slips and were about to send out a message. However, several sword lights descended from the sky and accurately destroyed the transmission jade slips in their hands. Fortunately, they dodged quickly, or their arms would have been smashed to pieces by the sword lights. The two god generals immediately understood that Kenshin had been watching them. If they made any strange movements, Kenshin would mercilessly kill them. In their fear, the two god generals did not dare to act rashly. They could only tightly grip their sabers and stare at the Kenshin in the sky. Of course, with their strength, they could not tell whether the Kenshin in the sky was a clone or the actual body. Ji Tianxing's clone did not waste any words with them. He directly used his ultimate skill and launched an attack. Heavenly Dragon Palm. God-slaying sword. His left hand struck out with a dragon-shaped palm shadow, while his right hand waved the divine sword, sending out dozens of dazzling sword lights. Although the 1,000-odd soldiers were on guard, they were sealed in the sword formation and had no room to dodge. They could only use their full strength to defend. Bam, bam, bam. Rumble. The dazzling palm shadows slammed into the crowd with deafening booms. The dazzling golden sword lights slashed into the crowd, causing blood and flesh to splatter everywhere. The 1,000-odd soldiers were slaughtered, suffering heavy casualties. Nearly half of the soldiers were blasted to pieces by the palm shadows and sword lights. Even their godheads collapsed. The other half of the soldiers were lucky enough to block the palm shadows and sword lights. They did not lose their lives on the spot, but they still suffered injuries of varying degrees. Even the two strongest divine generals were disheveled and embarrassed. Before the soldiers could gather and launch a counterattack, Xianxia unleashed another devastating divine ability at the soldiers. This time, the divine ability he unleashed was not only the overwhelming sword lights, but also flames, lightning, and all kinds of pillars of light that blotted out the sky. The two god generals came back to their senses and hurriedly commanded the hundreds of soldiers to work together to defend. Hundreds of god kings and god sovereigns cast their arts with all their might despite their fear. They unleashed dazzling five-colored divine art images. The spells and abilities unleashed by the two sides clashed violently in the air, resulting in a deafening boom. Bam, 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 boom, rumble. A series of loud, muffled sounds reverberated between heaven and earth. However, the divine abilities of the hundreds of soldiers were no match for the divine abilities of Xianxia's clone. In the blink of an eye, more than 200 people were blown to smithereens in the dazzling sword light, lightning, and fire, dying on the spot. The soldiers of the two god generals panicked, trying to find a way to escape from the sword formation. While blocking the attacks of Xianxia's clone, they checked the structure of the sword formation, hoping to find a flaw and escape. However, they needed time to find a flaw and even more time to break the formation. During this long period of time, Xianxia's clone continued to attack, gradually killing the hundreds of soldiers. 15 minutes later, the battle came to an end and the hundreds of soldiers were killed. Only the two god generals and a few heavily injured god kings were left, struggling to hold on. However, their morale and spirit had collapsed, and their strength was almost exhausted. They knew that they could not hold on for much longer before being killed by Xianxia. Before they died, the two god generals were filled with unwillingness. They shouted at Xianxia's clone, "Xianxia, if you're still as supreme, then let us die with a clear understanding. You are in illusory sun-blessed land, so why are you here? Our whereabouts and plans were very secretive, so how did you know we were here?" If they could not figure this out, the two god generals would not die in peace. Xianxia's clone did not hide anything and sneered, "Don't suspect anything, there are no spies or insiders who leaked any information to me. I deduced that he would do this based on Empyrean God King's nature. Not only you but also the Li tribe. The other three forces will also be attacked. I predicted the enemy's move, so I sent my clone to rescue you. Now do you understand?" Hearing this, the two god generals were filled with shock and disbelief. After being stunned for a long time, the two of them nodded blankly and smiled bitterly. "I see. The battle between powerhouses is never a battle of strength, but more of a battle of wits. Seems like Celestial King has lost. Haha, so it was not Xianxia who defeated us but only his clone." The two god generals were in complete despair. One of Xianxia's clones was enough to destroy their 9,000-strong army. It was not hard to imagine that the other three forces would not fare any better. In short, Celestial King's plan was a complete failure. The two god generals understood the cause and effect and had no more regrets. Xianxia did not waste any more words with them and attacked again using all kinds of skills. Boom, 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 boom. With a series of loud explosions, the two god generals and a few god kings were drowned in lightning and sword radiance. Soon, everyone was blasted into smithereens and turned into ashes. 100 breaths later, Xianxia's clone removed the sword formation, picked up the godhead fragments and rings of the god kings and flew away. This was despite the fact that he had only killed over 7,000 of the 9,000 soldiers in this army. The other 1,000 soldiers had already scattered and fled, and no one knew where they went. But he did not plan to chase after them and let them escape to pass the news to Celestial King. At the same time, outside the cave abodes of the other three forces, the battle was also ongoing. The second force to be attacked was the Fengxian clan. Two god generals led the 9,000-strong army to attack the cave abodes of the Fengxian clan. They originally wanted to use some tricks to sneak into the cave abodes of the Fengxian clan, and then take the opportunity to cause trouble and sneak attack. But the Fengxian clan received the news in advance, and closed the entrance of the cave abodes, and gathered all their forces to guard the defensive formation. The army had no choice but to attack the entrance of the cave abodes of the Fengxian clan, and attack the defensive formation with all their might. Ji Tianxing's clone was not in a hurry to attack. He waited for the army to attack continuously for 4 hours, and when they had exhausted a lot of their energy and relaxed their spirits, then he attacked. The same thing happened again. Ji Tianxing's clones still used the sword rain, and 90,000 starry giant swords bombarded the 9,000-strong army. After a few breaths, the sword rain and strangulation ended, and more than 3,000 of the 9,000-strong army were killed. The remaining 5,000 people were still in shock and they were filled with panic. At this time, Ji Tianxing's clone appeared again, and used the heaven-destroying sword formation to seal the entire army. Chapter 4296. The battle at the Fengshuan clan's side was not over yet. Ji Tianxing's doppelganger was still casting spells to seal and kill the remaining troops. On the other side, the third troop launched an attack on the Yanguang sect. The mental journey and encounters of these troops were highly similar. They wanted to find an opportunity to plot or sneak into the target's cave abode to cause trouble. However, the target had closed the cave abode's entrance and was in a defensive posture, making it impossible for them to attack. They could not come up with a good idea, but they had to carry out the Celestial King's orders. In the end, they could only attack forcefully with the intention of breaking through the cave abode's entrance and killing their way inside. However, each cave abode was the foundation of each clan and sect. After more than 10,000 years of accumulation and reinforcement, its defensive power was very strong. Even if the three troops attacked at all costs, it was impossible to break through quickly. When the three troops were exhausted and had to rest and relax, Ji Tianxing's doppelganger attacked decisively. It was the same formula, the same process and the same result. First, he used the sword rain technique to kill the three troops with thousands of swords. They were stunned and suffered heavy casualties. Then Ji Tianxing's doppelganger used the heaven punishment sword formation to trap the remaining troops and kill them one by one. In order to frighten the enemy and create more opportunities to attack, his doppelganger would appear openly. When the three troops saw his doppelganger, they were dumbfounded and completely confused. Everyone knew that Kenshin was in illusory sun paradise. How could he appear here? It must be an illusion. Something must have gone wrong somewhere. The successive shocks made the three troops' emotions and state of mind fluctuate. They were confused for a while and their combat power naturally weakened. Ji Tianxing's three doppelganger could act independently and did not affect each other. Therefore, in just half a day the three troops attacked the target one after another but were all stopped by his doppelganger. In the end, the three troops were destroyed by Ji Tianxing's doppelganger. Ji Tianxing's doppelganger collected the spoils of war and left quietly. Until now, the patriarchs and sect masters of the three clans and sects were still on their way back. After the battle, the elders and disciples of the three clans and sects were all in a state of confusion. There was clearly an army attacking their cave abode, and it had been going on for 4 to 6 hours. Why did the army stop attacking midway and even retreat? Did the situation change? Or did reinforcements come to their aid and defeat the enemy? Filled with confusion and anxiety, the people of the three families and sects performed their secret techniques to find out what was going on outside the cave. When they saw the situation outside, the elders and deacons who were casting the spell were stunned. For some reason, tens of thousands of miles around the cave dwelling had been reduced to ruins. The violent power and aura left behind by the great battle were still reverberating between heaven and earth. Furthermore, the ground was littered with the wreckage of warships, the fragments of weapons and armors, as well as the corpses of countless enemies. The elders and deacons told everyone what they had seen, but no one believed them. In the end, the people of the three clans and sects gathered their courage and opened the exit of the cave abode. Many elders and deacons personally went to the scene to check. When they confirmed that the enemy troops who had attacked them had indeed been destroyed, everyone was so shocked that they were unable to control themselves. They were also filled with confusion. They couldn't make up their minds and didn't know what to do, so they reported the news to the patriarchs and sect masters. The three patriarchs and sect masters who were rushing back received the message from the elders not long ago. They knew that the cave abode had been attacked by the army sent by the Celestial King, and they were all worried. At this time they received another message saying that the army had been attacking for 4 to 6 hours and had been inexplicably annihilated. The first reaction of the three patriarchs and sect masters was, "Are you kidding me? There was no other way. There was only a difference of 6 hours, but the contents of the two messages were completely different. It was too absurd. However, after the 3 patriarchs and sect masters came back to their senses, they calmed down. They believed that the elders and deacons wouldn't dare to deceive them. The news must be true. Then who helped them resolve the crisis and annihilate the enemy? The answer was obvious. In the firmament land, under the current situation, who had the courage to save them? Who had the strength to annihilate thousands of troops in such a short time? Except for Kenshin, there was no one else. But the problem was that Kenshin was in the illusionary sun paradise. When they left the illusionary sun paradise, Kenshin hadn't left yet. What was going on? Li Yuan, Feng Sunmi and Sect Master Yan Guang were a little confused. On the way back, they analyzed for a long time but couldn't find a more reasonable answer. After a long time of hesitation and struggle, they gathered their courage and sent a message to Kenshin, asking if it was Kenshin who had saved them. When Ji Tianxing received the message from the 3 patriarchs and sect masters, he was outside the entrance of the Shifeng pavilion, staring at the army that hadn't moved. He thought that the other 3 armies had already attacked the target. How could the army outside the Shifeng pavilion be so calm? However, this army might have received some news and knew what happened to the other 3 armies. After hiding for a day, they didn't even have the courage to attack the Shifeng pavilion. They hurriedly boarded the battleship and turned around to escape. Seeing this, Ji Tianxing knew that the news of the 3 armies' annihilation had spread. Of course, he couldn't let this army go. He hurriedly performed the sword rain and summoned 90,000 starry giant swords to kill the 3 godly battleships and the 9,000 soldiers. The army was lining up to board the battleship. They didn't expect the sword rain to fall from the sky. Their eyes were filled with fear and panic. Everyone shouted, roared, and scattered to escape and hide. But it was useless. The 90,000 starry giant swords fell in the blink of an eye. With a loud rumble, the 3 godly battleships and the 9,000 soldiers were drowned by the sword light. Even though the generals in the Immortal King realm and the masters operating the godly battleships cast spells in time to block the sword light. But the power of the sword rain was too terrifying. In the blink of an eye, the 3 godly battleships were blasted into smithereens by the sword light. They turned into countless pieces of wreckage and scattered in the ruins. The 9,000 soldiers were also scattered. At least 3,000 people died on the spot and turned into ashes. The 5,000 people who survived also suffered light or heavy injuries. They were filled with fear and panic as they fled without any order. The 2 god generals were also very fearful and anxious, but they had to calm down. They issued all kinds of orders and commanded the soldiers to work together to resist. At this moment, Ji Tianxing performed the heaven-destroying sword formation again and sealed the surviving army. He appeared in the sky openly and looked down at the army with an indifferent expression. More than 5,000 people looked up at him. After seeing his face clearly, they were completely flustered. Chapter 4297. Not long ago this army received the news. The other 3 armies attacked one after another, but Kenshin took the opportunity to ambush them. Other than the army that attacked the Li tribe, where thousands of deserters survived, the other 2 armies were completely annihilated. When they heard the news, they thought they had misheard and were hallucinating. However, they were certain that this news was sent out by the 3 armies at the cost of their lives when they were attacked. After the news was reported to the Celestial King, the Celestial King checked it out before sending his messenger guards to relay the news to them. In other words, this news was confirmed by the Celestial King. Could not be fake. Thus, the 2 divine generals and the soldiers calmed down and thought about it. They guessed the crux of the matter. Kenshin had the ability to foresee the future. He actually predicted the Celestial King's plan. This was already very shocking. And he was able to rush from illusory sun-blessed ground to each cave residence in 3 days. His speed was unparalleled in the world. As for why he appeared outside the 3 cave residences at the same time and destroyed the 3 armies, it must be because he refined an avatar. However, other people could only refine 1 avatar, but he was different. He actually refined 3 avatars. No, it should be 4. If the Kenshin guarding illusory sun-blessed ground was Kenshin's original body, then there must be a 4th avatar. That sword god definitely had a 4th incarnation and he was probably on his way here. His goal was to destroy them. After understanding this, the 2 divine generals no longer hesitated. They hurriedly gathered the soldiers to board the ship and prepare to evacuate. However, just as they were about to board the ship, they were met with a devastating attack. While the casualties were heavy, everyone guessed that Kenshin was here. Other than Kenshin, no one else would arrive at this time. They also did not have the strength and courage to rescue Shifeng Pavilion. Even though everyone was mentally prepared when the sword god really appeared, everyone was still extremely terrified. That was why the soldiers were fleeing with all their might. It was a complete mess. No matter how the two divine generals gave orders, even if they swung their swords to cut down a few panicked deserters, they could not stop the chaos. In the end, it was Kenshin who used the heaven-destroying sword formation to seal off the area within a radius of 10,000 miles. Only then was the chaotic situation resolved. The soldiers who were fleeing blindly were blocked by the sword formation and could not escape. Only then did they obediently return to the formation and follow the orders of the two immortal generals to form a battle formation. At the moment of life and death, it was ironic that the enemy was more powerful than the general. Next, the two sides did not exchange much words and began to fight. More than 5,000 people against one Kenshin. The disparity was too great and there was no suspense. But in reality, it was the Kenshin that slaughtered these soldiers. No one could hurt Kenshin. Even if hundreds of people worked together to cast their divine abilities and secret arts, they still couldn't touch him. On the other hand, it was Kenshin's divine abilities and sword techniques that could slaughter hundreds of soldiers with each move. The battle only lasted for half an hour before it ended. More than 5,000 soldiers were killed, and only the two divine generals survived to the very end. Before dying, one of the divine generals was covered in wounds and dripping with blood. He looked at Ji Tianxing in despair and said, "Kenshin truly lives up to his name. In terms of strength, tactics and schemes, even the Celestial King is no match for you. Other than His Majesty the God Emperor, no one in the God realm can contend against you." The other divine general was filled with unwillingness. He stared at Ji Tianxing and asked in a hoarse voice, "How can you refine 4 avatars? How can just one avatar be so powerful?" Ji Tianxing looked at him and calmly replied, "It's not an avatar. The ones that were left in illusory sun-blessed land and destroyed the 3 armies were all my avatars." Hearing this, the divine general was stunned for a moment. His eyes that were filled with despair and darkness immediately lit up. "You mean, you're not an avatar but Kenshin's true body?" Ji Tianxing nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The divine general threw his head back and laughed loudly. Blood sprayed out from his nose and mouth as he said in a muffled voice, "In comparison, we're much stronger than those 6 divine generals. At least we died under the sword of Kenshin's true body. It's more honorable than them." Being killed by Kenshin's true body was probably the last bit of comfort they could find in the midst of despair and death. Swoosh, swoosh. Ji Tianxing raised his sword and swung it down. Blood splattered everywhere as 2 divine generals were killed, their heads separated from their bodies. He collected the spoils of war scattered among the ruins. He only picked up the space rings and quintessence shards of the 32 divine kings before turning to leave. At this point, the 4 armies had been destroyed by Ji Tianxing. Celestial King's plan had been thwarted. Ji Tianxing then picked up his communication jade slip and sent a message to Li Yuan, Feng Sunmi, Sect Master Yan Guang and Pavilion Master Shifeng. The contents of the messages were basically the same. It was to inform them that the armies that attacked their abodes had been destroyed. They no longer needed to be anxious and could continue their journey in peace. When they returned to their abodes, they would have to select elite disciples to be on standby at any time. Soon Ji Tianxing would arrange tasks for them to start conquering the firmament land. In the center of the firmament land, in the mysterious and majestic heaven capital, Celestial King received the news that the 4th army that attacked Pavilion Master Shifeng had also been destroyed. He was furious to the extreme and wanted nothing more than to tear the sword god into 1,000 pieces. In a fit of rage, he smashed a divine jade table and destroyed half of the hall. Many guards and generals were trembling in fear and kept quiet out of fear. All this time, the Empyrean God King had always been high and mighty, always confident in his plans and the Pearl of Wisdom. It was as if he had no opponents and had never encountered any setbacks or failures. However, since the first day Kenshin set foot on the firmament land, he had suffered one setback after another. His repeated failures made him lose all faith, and his image as a powerhouse was completely torn apart. In front of Kenshin, his so-called wisdom, stratagems, and shrewdness seemed so stupid and even ridiculous. He was burning with anger and wanted to gather tens of thousands of troops to fight Kenshin to the death. However, after these failures, he finally understood something. Now the initiative was in Kenshin's hands. Even if he was determined to fight Kenshin, he was afraid that he would not get what he wanted. The sword god might not fight him head-on, but he would definitely use all kinds of schemes to beat him into a sorry state, making him suffer a crushing defeat and become the laughingstock of the world. With this layer of scruples, no matter how angry Celestial King was, he did not dare to send out troops at will. He forced himself to calm down and think carefully about how to deal with this. If he could not come up with a good plan, then he could only gather all his forces and defend Heaven Capital until the end. Chapter 4298. 4 days passed quickly. Li Yuan, Feng Sunmi, Sect Master Yanguang, and Pavilion Master Shifeng returned to their respective cave residences. After they returned to their residences, they explained the truth to the elders, deacons, and disciples under their command. The disciples of the four forces were very excited when they learned that Kenshin had resolved the crisis and saved them. Especially since the clan leaders and sect masters had pledged their loyalty to Kenshin. In other words, the disciples of the four forces had all become Kenshin's subordinates. Now that they had such a powerful backer, they felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders and their hearts were at ease. Out of their excitement, gratitude, and admiration for Kenshin, the four forces used their intelligence network to spread the news. Before this, there had already been rumors spreading. Many forces and experts knew that Celestial King had sent out 4 armies to attack the Li tribe, Fengshuan tribe, Yanguang sect, and Shifeng Pavilion. Celestial King did not dare to attack Kenshin, so he wanted to destroy the 4 forces to regain his dignity and turn the situation around. However, Kenshin was smart and predicted Celestial King's plan in advance, so he sent out a few clones to help. In the end, the 4 armies sent out by Celestial King were all destroyed by Kenshin. When the various forces and experts heard the news, they found it hard to believe. For the past 3 days, they had been discussing the matter and felt that it was too absurd and bizarre. However, after the 4 forces used various channels and methods to spread the news, the various forces and experts had no choice but to accept the truth. After all, the 4 forces were victims and participants in the whole thing. Not only did they have the right to speak, but they could also describe the process in detail and present various evidence. Even if the various forces and experts had doubts, they were all dispelled. When they accepted the truth, they were extremely shocked and were even more in awe and admiration of Kenshin's methods and schemes. Naturally, the mentality of some forces and experts was affected, and their attitudes and standpoints changed. At the very least, in the next few days, the wills of several ancient clans and top factions were shaken. Their elders, protectors, hall leaders, and other experts began to have disagreements and started to debate whether to support Kenshin or pledge loyalty to Kenshin. The situation in Firmament Land gradually became clear. Between Celestial King and Kenshin, only one would survive and rule the land. Therefore, if they wanted to benefit from the turmoil and change, they had to face the question of whether to pledge loyalty to Celestial King or Kenshin. The experts of the various forces were also debating about this question. Of course, some clans and forces were determined to remain neutral and observe the situation. They didn't want to make progress, but they also didn't want to get into trouble. They continued to be silent bystanders. A few days later, the relevant news spread across Firmament Land. The people of almost 100 regions, thousands of empires, and almost 10,000 divine kingdoms heard the news one after another. Everyone was shocked by this, but at the same time they were very excited. They hoped that Kenshin would come to Firmament Land and overthrow the Nebula God Emperor's rule and restore freedom to everyone. Now their dreams and wishes were coming true. After Kenshin came to Firmament Land, he did not hide for long. Instead, he made a high-profile appearance. Moreover, in just a few days, Kenshin participated in 2 battles in a row and won in a crushing manner. The facts proved that Kenshin was not only stronger than Celestial King, but also much more shrewd and cunning. This allowed all the citizens to see hope and increased their confidence. This matter was spread everywhere among the commoners. When the commoners discussed the related news, they all worshipped the sword god. Even the rulers and nobles of the kingdoms and empires were shocked and in awe of Kenshin's wisdom and cunning. They were not qualified to participate in the battle between Celestial King and Kenshin. They could only guard their own territories and observe the situation quietly. No matter who won in the end, as long as they were not too unlucky, they would still be able to control their own territories. Of course, there was not much difference between being loyal to Celestial King and being loyal to Kenshin. The only difference was that if they were loyal to Celestial King, the people in their territories would be slaves and would not be free. If they were loyal to Kenshin, all the people would regain their freedom and would no longer be oppressed and exploited. For the rulers of the kingdoms and kingdoms, their power would be greatly reduced. Therefore, many rulers and nobles still hoped that Celestial King would win and let them maintain the status quo. A few days were enough for the four forces to select 1,000 elite disciples. The clan leaders, faction leaders and pavilion leaders did not receive any orders from Kenshin. They led the 1,000 disciples to practice various battle formations and joint attacks. As for Kenshin's whereabouts and plans, no one knew for the time being. The clan leaders and faction leaders thought that Kenshin would most likely return to illusory sun-blessed land after rescuing them. However, Zhou Xian did not plan to return after leaving a doppelganger in illusory sun-blessed land. He did not meet up with his 3 doppelganger either. Instead, he divided into 4 groups and began to wander around the firmament land. Every time he arrived at a region, he would try to sneak into the domain chief's manor and use various tricks to create chaos in the domain chief's manor. When the time was right, he would kill the guards of the domain chief's manor. In the end, he destroyed the entire domain chief's manor by himself. He killed or captured all the guards and drove the rest away. As for the domain chief's manor, he sealed it with a formation. Unless he cast the spell himself or had the token to unlock the seal, no one could enter or leave. He and his 3 doppelganger attacked the various domain chief's mansions. Jiku, Chao Qingyu, Bai Feng and the others also divided into several groups to carry out the same task. A few days later, Zhou Xian issued another order to the 5 forces. Each force sent out 1,000 elite soldiers to attack the domain chief's mansions in each region. After occupying them, they would seal them with a formation. The domain chief had already brought the elite masters to Heaven Capital in the occupied domain chief's mansions. The forces left behind in the domain chief's mansions were not strong. Therefore, the operation of Zhou Xian and his subordinates was very smooth, and they did not encounter any setbacks. In just 1 month, they had attacked and occupied more than 40 domain chief's mansions. As a result, the more than 40 regions were leaderless and panicked. Of course, there were still some domain chief who did not rush to Heaven Capital as ordered. After Zhou Xian and his soldiers arrived, few of the domain chief's mansions resisted. They all surrendered obediently. Therefore, Zhou Xian and his subordinates took out the jade slips that they had prepared beforehand and asked the domain chief to swear their surrender. In this way, one region after another fell and broke away from the control of the Celestial King. Bookhouse Reading Website. Chapter 4299. The soldiers of the Rebel Alliance's branch in the Firmament Continent ignored the massive forces gathered in Heaven Capital and focused on conquering all the regions in the Firmament Continent. They divided into more than a dozen groups, constantly attacking and conquering one region after another. The commoners of the various regions cheered and jumped for joy, celebrating and excited. However, the dignitaries and emperors in those regions were uneasy. They were afraid that the Rebel Alliance would destroy them too. Fortunately, the experts of the Rebel Alliance had a clear goal. They wanted to clear out the domain chief's mansions in all regions and seal them as soon as possible. They were not interested in any other people or forces other than that. Many people, onlookers and experts were thinking that the Rebel Alliance's forces were scattered and they were attacking and sealing the domain chief's mansions. This was the Rebel Alliance's weakest moment. It was also the best time for the Celestial King to fight back. As long as he decisively sent troops to attack, even if he could not wipe out all the Rebel Alliance, he could at least kill more than half of the Rebel Alliance. Many people thought that the Celestial King could not help but take action. Even many people in the Rebel Alliance, especially the experts of the 5 forces, thought so. They had been worried that the Celestial King would send troops to intercept them or attack their nest. That would be a big problem. However, when they told Zhou Xian about their thoughts, Zhou Xian told them with certainty that the Celestial King did not have the courage and determination to do so. Although it sounded unreasonable, Everyone chose to believe in Kenshin. They dispelled their worries and continued to carry out the mission. The reason why Ji Tianxing was so certain was because he had figured out Empyrean God King's nature. Before he arrived at the firmament continent, the Celestial King and countless experts and forces knew that he would come. At that time he had already conquered the boundless heaven continent and the reincarnation island. He was very famous and was invincible among the 5 god emperors. Even though the Celestial King had a large number of troops in his hands, he still felt uneasy and placed himself in the position of the weak. After Ji Tianxing arrived at the firmament land, he first killed General Nan Feng and his 10,000 soldiers. Then he showed up in a high-profile manner. This not only won him the cheers and support of the people, but also put a lot of pressure on the Celestial King. As a result, the Celestial King did not dare to fight with him. He could only avoid him and send troops to attack the Li tribe, the Fengxuan tribe, the Yanguang sect, and the Shifang pavilion. In the end, the Celestial King's plot was predicted by him, and he personally intercepted and killed him. The 36,000 men of the 4 armies were almost completely wiped out. This was yet another devastating blow to the Celestial King. At this moment, the Celestial King was already irritable and worried about his gains and losses. It was impossible for him to remain calm and rational. As the saying goes, once, twice, and never thrice. Celestial King had lost twice to Kenshin, and it was a complete loss. Whether in terms of strength, means, or shrewdness, he was completely crushed by Kenshin. The firmament land had already spread a rumor that he had become a laughingstock. Celestial King had a strong sense of self-esteem. How could he let Kenshin crush him for the 3rd time? In his opinion, Kenshin was cunning. Such an obvious flaw must have been deliberately set up by Kenshin to lure him into action so that he could take advantage of the opportunity to deal a heavy blow to him. The easier it seemed to be, the more likely it was to be a trap. For the past month, the Celestial King was determined to defend Heaven Capital. No matter how the Rebel Alliance attacked the city outside, he was determined not to take action. Even if many of the territorial masters and generals under his command advised him, he ignored them. The territorial masters and generals said that the Rebel Alliance's forces were all deployed. They were scattered into dozens of routes to attack the territorial masters' mansions. What other conspiracy could Kenshin have? As long as they sent out troops at this time, they could definitely annihilate half of the Rebel Alliance. Moreover, Kenshin was too busy to rescue them in time. It seemed that the territorial masters and generals' words were very reasonable and won the support of many soldiers. However, Celestial King refuted them with a few words. What you see is only the surface. How do you know that this is not Kenshin's scheme? You are not Kenshin. How can you be sure that he is too busy to rescue them in time? We have already suffered 2 losses and suffered so many casualties. Why haven't you learned your lesson? I am sure that as long as we send out troops, Kenshin will definitely take them all and leave no one alive. There is nothing that Kenshin can't do that you can't think of. The realm masters and generals were rendered speechless. They could only give up on the idea of sending troops to battle. Indeed, on the surface, it seemed that Kenshin only had a few troops under his command. It was impossible for him to set up any more traps and ambushes. However, who could be sure? The Sword God was someone who was good at creating miracles. As Celestial King said, there was nothing that Kenshin couldn't think of. On the other hand, the illusory Sun Sect Master was Ji Tianxing's most trusted subordinate in Firmament Mainland. He had also asked Ji Tianxing why he was so sure. Ji Tianxing smiled and said, Celestial King has been defeated twice in a row. He has become the laughingstock of the people in Firmament Mainland. He has been described as stupid, childish, and ridiculous. With his self-esteem, how can he accept such slander and ridicule? He has been traumatized by me. Now he doesn't want to achieve anything, he just wants to avoid any mistakes. Even if we go all out, he won't dare to send out troops and split up his troops to kill us. Because he will firmly believe that this is a trap and a conspiracy set by me. Even if we seem to be full of flaws, they are flaws that I deliberately showed to him. After listening to Ji Tianxing's explanation, the illusory Sun Sect Master suddenly understood and quickly replied, Sir Kenshin is brilliant. You have grasped the psychology of Celestial King very accurately. You have seen through his mind. Compared to you, he is really stupid. Ji Tianxing smiled again and said, Celestial King has made up his mind not to attack easily. He will defend Heaven Capital and wait for the final battle. Therefore we will smoothly occupy the 100 territories and control all the domain chiefs' mansions. However, the forces of the Rebel Alliance are too weak to be compared with the forces under Celestial King's command. Sky Universe had already lost 45,000 soldiers in the 2 previous battles, but Skuniverse God King still hadn't fully recovered. However, there are still 50,000 soldiers in Heaven Capital. They are still strictly defending and the city is impregnable. Therefore we can't forcibly attack Heaven Capital and fight Celestial King. Hearing this, the Illusory Sun Sect Master nodded in agreement. He asked with some concern, "Sir, what should we do after we conquer the 100 territories?" Ji Tianqing said calmly, "I have a plan. You just need to follow the order step by step. When the time is right you will naturally understand." Chapter 4300. After more than a month of contact, the head of the Xuanri sect gained Ji Tianqing's trust and high regard. Even Ji Tianqing's attitude towards him was different from that of the leaders of the other 4 forces. Ji Tianqing didn't explain much to Li Yuan, Feng Sunmi, the head of the Yanguang sect and the Shifeng Pavilion Master. The 4 experts didn't dare to ask too much and just carried out their tasks according to his orders. Only the head of the Xuanri sect would take the initiative to figure out Ji Tianqing's ideas and plans, and he would find out and fill in the gaps in time, trying to make Ji Tianqing worry as little as possible. It turned out that Ji Tianqing only needed to give a general direction and plan for more than a month. The head of the Xuanri sect would take the initiative to solve many small and side issues without Ji Tianqing's order. It was because of this that Ji Tianqing valued him even more. The reason why he explained so much to him was that he wanted to train him and teach him some ideas. In this way, Ji Tianqing would be more assured when he left the Firmament Land and handed over the power to the head of the Xuanri sect. Unknowingly 2 months had passed. With the efforts of various experts of the Rebel Alliance, they finally conquered 99 territories. Among them, 78 domain lords were ordered to lead troops to Tiandu. Their territory leaders' mansions were emptied and sealed by a formation. The other 21 territory leaders were not ordered to go to Heaven Capital. They stayed in the territory leaders' mansions and were forced to swear allegiance to Kenshin. In this way, the 100 territories of the Firmament Land were temporarily controlled by the Rebel Alliance. Only the Firmament territory where Heaven Capital was located was not invaded by the Rebel Alliance. Next, the Rebel Alliance only needed to conquer the Firmament territory and occupy Heaven Capital. Then they could completely control the Firmament Land. But everyone knew that the real decisive battle was yet to come. The Rebel Alliance had been going smoothly. The most dangerous and difficult part was to attack Heaven Capital. These 2 months were too long for the people of the Firmament Land. They waited anxiously. To the nobles and emperors of the 100 territories, these 2 months were extremely torturous and frightening. As for the domain lords and soldiers in Tiandu, these 2 months could be said to be the most sullen. They knew that the members of the Rebel Alliance had split into more than a dozen groups to invade their homes and the domain chief's manor, but they could do nothing about it. They knew that the people of the Firmament Land would laugh at them and ridicule them, but they could only stay in Heaven Capital and could not take a single step out of it. Who could understand that kind of anger, humiliation, and helplessness? Over the past 2 months, the dozens of domain masters and tens of thousands of soldiers were full of complaints. Their negative and lazy moods were very serious. In the past, they respected and revered the Celestial King because the Celestial King was powerful and wise. Over the past few months, they had seen with their own eyes that the Celestial King's disguise was torn apart, revealing his true colors of brutality, suspicion, and incompetence. The Celestial King's position in the hearts of the soldiers had also plummeted. After putting aside their reverence, the loyalty of the dozens of domain masters and tens of thousands of soldiers to him would also decline. There were even many rumors circulating among the tens of thousands of soldiers in Tiandu. Many people secretly said that the Celestial King was scared by the Kenshin and did not have the courage to fight again, so he chose to hide in Heaven Capital. Some people also said that the Celestial King did not see the overall situation and only cared about his own face, so he had missed the best opportunity to fight back. Of course, the Celestial King was not as incompetent as the soldiers said. It was just that he met the Kenshin and was played in the palm of his hand, so he appeared to be so stupid, suspicious, and timid. In addition, the rumors and slanders that were circulating among the soldiers were also heard by the Celestial King's spies. When the spies and informants reported the rumors to the Celestial King was undoubtedly furious. Without any hesitation or consideration, he directly issued an order to arrest those who spread the rumors and slanders, execute them in public and kill them without mercy. As soon as the order was issued, more than 500 soldiers were arrested and beheaded in public within 3 days. This caused a sensation and panic in Heaven Capital. Tens of thousands of soldiers were scared into silence and no longer dared to criticize the Celestial King behind his back. But the soldiers only surrendered on the surface, and their contempt and disgust for the Celestial King became even more serious. In their view, only a cowardly and incompetent person would be so vicious to the soldiers under his command. In just a few days, some news accidentally leaked by the Rebel Alliance began to spread in the firmament mainland. According to rumors, a certain Li clan leader whose name could not be revealed had always been careless, without any scheming or shrewdness. 2 months ago, this person had to lead his people on a mission and was ordered to keep his mouth shut by the Kenshin, so he did not dare to reveal any information. However, at the celebration banquet a few days ago, this patriarch got drunk and spoke the truth after drinking, wantonly mocking the Celestial King. He laughed that the Celestial King was as timid as a mouse and had long been scared out of his wits by the Kenshin. The Rebel Alliance formed by the Kenshin only had 5 forces, and they did not have time to expand and absorb more forces. 2 months ago, the 5 forces of the Rebel Alliance came out in full force, divided into more than a dozen groups and conquered various regions one by one. That was the perfect time for the Celestial King to counterattack the Rebel Alliance, as he could easily send out 10 or 20,000 troops and kill half of the people of the Rebel Alliance. But unexpectedly, the Celestial King was so timid, cowardly and incompetent that he hid in Heaven Capital and watched the Kenshin conquer the entire firmament mainland. Facing such a powerful and intelligent master like the Kenshin, the Celestial King was so stupid that he paled in comparison. Somehow, this Patriarch Li's drunken mantra spread out through some channels and quickly spread across the firmament land. Hundreds of millions of people laughed and laughed at the Celestial King unscrupulously when they heard the news. They guessed right, the Celestial King was really scared out of his wits. When the nobles, masters and top forces heard the news, they were first shocked by the strategy and courage of the Kenshin, and then felt sad and ashamed for the Celestial King. Of course, there were also a few masters who doubted the authenticity of this news, wondering if it was fake news deliberately released by the Kenshin. But the news that spread later proved the authenticity of this rumor. It was said that the Patriarch Li was scolded by the Kenshin for a slip of the tongue after he was drunk. He was whipped 100 times by the Thunder God's whip in public and was also punished by not drinking for 100 years. Every 2 days the Rebel Alliance would release a declaration of rebellion, calling for the ambitious and top forces of the firmament mainland to join the Rebel Alliance and overthrow the dark reign of the Nebula God Emperor. From this incident, it could be seen that the Kenshin only had 5 forces under his command. They were seriously short of military strength and could not attack Heaven Capital. Chapter 4301. The Kenshin's punishment of the drunken Li Yuan and the Rebel Alliance's declaration of rebellion were enough to prove that the Celestial King had missed the best opportunity to counterattack. Hundreds of millions of people, nobles and experts all believed that the Rebel Alliance was indeed lacking in military strength. And the Celestial King's paranoia and timidity were confirmed, and he was ridiculed by the people of the entire continent. For a time, the Celestial King's prestige and reputation fell to the bottom, and he became the biggest laughingstock. Although the Rebel Alliance was lacking in military strength, everyone was full of confidence in the Kenshin. They firmly believed that the Kenshin would definitely be able to break through Tiandu and defeat the Celestial King. At the same time, the Celestial King and the tens of thousands of soldiers in Tiandu also received a series of news. When they learned that Li Yuan had spoken the truth after drinking and was punished by the Kenshin, and that the Rebel Alliance was publicly recruiting capable people, the entire Tiandu was in an uproar. The tens of thousands of soldiers finally confirmed that their previous guesses were correct. The rumors and slanders that had been circulating among the soldiers and the criticism of the Celestial King were all confirmed. That's right, the previous 2 months were when the Rebel Alliance's forces were scattered and at their weakest. It was because the Celestial King was scared out of his wits and was too afraid of the Kenshin that he missed the best opportunity to counterattack. The Celestial King cared too much about his reputation and face and did not care about the lives of the soldiers, nor did he care about the homes of the dozens of domain masters and tens of thousands of soldiers. The main culprit that caused the current passive situation was the Celestial King. As the saying goes, a stone stirs up 1,000 ripples. The dozens of domain masters and tens of thousands of soldiers counted old and new grudges together, and all kinds of emotions surged in their hearts, and they became very agitated. Those domain masters already had complaints about the Celestial King, and now they hated the Celestial King's muddle-headedness that caused their caves and territories to be occupied by the Rebel Alliance for nothing. Tens of thousands of soldiers also ignored the military order and criticized the Celestial King everywhere, saying that he was muddle-headed and incompetent. Even the ordinary soldiers knew that the previous 2 months were the best time to counterattack, but the Celestial King was stubborn and refused to send a single soldier. If this wasn't incompetence, then what was? Therefore, the tens of thousands of soldiers were agitated, and all their accumulated resentment towards the Celestial King exploded. Although they still had a bottom line, there were no mutinies or defections. However, the mentality of the tens of thousands of soldiers had changed. Their loyalty to the Celestial King had also fallen to the lowest point. Countless soldiers became lazy, passive, and lazy. Those who were supposed to be on sentry duty did not go, and those who were supposed to be patrolling and carrying out missions were lazy and unwilling. Even though the 50,000 soldiers were pieced together by many powers and dozens of domain lords. However, negativity and complaining can be contagious and spread quickly. The Celestial King's trusted generals and spies found that the situation was not good, and promptly reported to the Celestial King. At this time, Empyrean God King had locked himself in his study, venting his anger and humiliation in a fit of rage. Without a doubt, when the corresponding news spread in the firmament mainland, he had become synonymous with incompetence and stupidity, and had become the biggest joke in the world. In the entire firmament mainland, the angriest, the most embarrassed, and the most humiliated person was him. Kenshin did not need to do anything, nor did he need to use any tricks. He only needed to figure out his nature and psychology, and use a mixture of truth and lies to successfully take over 99 domains, and also humiliate him severely. At this time, the Celestial King was so humiliated that he wanted to find a hole to hide in. He locked himself in his study, unwilling to see anyone, including his trusted generals. He madly smashed things, roaring hysterically, and smashing the spacious and luxurious study into a mess, almost turning it into a ruin. After a few hours, he finally calmed down from his mania, and fell into the ruins with a gloomy look. He hesitated for a long time, and then walked into a secret room in the underground palace, and activated a special formation to contact the Nebula God Emperor in the depths of the void. Now, the Celestial King could not find anyone to help him, and could only confide in the Nebula God Emperor, and ask for guidance from the Nebula God Emperor. Although the Nebula God Emperor was far away in the depths of the void, and could not rush back in time, and could not rush back to the firmament mainland. However, the Nebula God Emperor was the Celestial King's last support, and as long as he could get the Nebula God Emperor's comfort, guidance, he would be more confident. No one knew what the Celestial King and the Nebula God Emperor talked about alone in the secret room. His trusted subordinates and generals only saw that 4 hours later, when he appeared in the Great Council Hall, his expression and emotions had returned to normal. Even so, Empyrean God King's calm demeanor still made the generals tremble with fear and dread. Even when the generals reported the news, they lowered their heads in fear and their voices were much lower. The generals reported 2 things. First, the tens of thousands of soldiers guarding Heaven Capital were agitated, and their prejudice against the Celestial King was very great. There were already signs of a mutiny, and they asked the Celestial King to suppress it as soon as possible. Hearing this news, the Celestial King frowned and anger appeared on his face again. According to his original intention, his first reaction was to catch a group of soldiers who took the lead in causing trouble, and behead them in public to frighten all the soldiers. Then he would gather dozens of domain masters and many immortal generals, and severely reprimand them, and order them to control the people under their command. But the Celestial King remembered the teachings of the Nebula God Emperor. The more intense and cruel the situation was, the more he could not use his usual fierce and cruel methods. Otherwise, it would only be counterproductive and stimulate the soldiers' rebellious mentality. Originally, there were only signs of a mutiny, but it would become a real mutiny and rebellion. Thus, the Celestial King calmed down and said to his trusted generals, This is the Kenshin's conspiracy, deliberately releasing the news to make the soldiers misunderstand me. This is a scheme to drive a wedge between us. Let those simple-minded soldiers think carefully. The people under the Kenshin have all made a heavenly oath. How could there be such a thing as a slip of the tongue after drinking? Also, the Rebel Alliance's public recruitment of soldiers is also a show for everyone to see. Tell those immortal generals and domain masters, if they can't even understand such a simple principle, they should quickly resign and get out of Heaven Capital. The trusted general pondered for a moment and felt that this was the right way to put it. He quickly nodded and said, This subordinate obeys. I will pass on your order later. Then he reported the second thing to the Celestial King. According to the report of the scouts, more than a dozen groups of people of the Rebel Alliance had basically joined the Kenshin, and were currently resting in the illusory sun paradise. Only 1,000 disciples of the Shifang Pavilion were rushing to the Domain Master's mansion in the realm of Green Heaven, preparing to attack it. The last unoccupied Domain Master's mansion on the whole continent was listed as one of the tasks of the Shifang Pavilion. Even though the Shifang Pavilion was under great pressure, it had to be completed. According to their estimated speed, they would arrive tomorrow morning at the latest. Chapter 4302. Hearing the news from his trusted general, Celestial King raised his eyebrows, and a light flashed through his eyes. He was keenly aware of something and an idea flashed through his mind, but he couldn't grasp it in time. Therefore he frowned and fell into deep thought. The trusted general saw that he was thinking about a problem, so he tactfully bowed and did not disturb him. He turned around and was about to leave. But Celestial King stopped him and ordered in a dignified tone, Pass down my order, let Divine Generals Qi, Lu and Lu gather 6,000 troops and wait for my orders. The trusted general was stunned for a moment, but he didn't think much and asked, My lord, are you going to send troops out? But those soldiers are passive and slack and their morale is low. I'm afraid it will be difficult for them to form an army, and they won't be able to exert much combat power. Celestial King said expressionlessly, Don't forget what I said before. You have to let those leaders and soldiers understand that this is all Kenshin's plot to drive a wedge between us. Besides, the soldiers have been staying in Heaven Capital for 2 months and can't go in or out, watching the 100 territories being occupied by Kenshin. That's why they have so many complaints. Now that I'm finally going to take action, the soldiers can also go out. How can they be passive and slack off? As long as you give the order, I'm sure many soldiers will eagerly sign up to follow Divine Generals Qi, Lu and Lu. Seeing that Celestial King was so determined, the trusted general didn't say more and chose to believe him. My lord, are you sending 3 divine generals with 6,000 troops to intercept and kill the 1,000 disciples of Shifang Pavilion? Now the forces of Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance are concentrated in illusory sun-blessed land, but the people of Shifang Pavilion are in the realm of Green Heaven. The distance between the 2 places is 5 days. No matter what, Kenshin won't be able to support them in time. It's reasonable to say that this is a good time to kill the disciples of Shifang Pavilion. The trusted general's tone was calm as he analyzed the situation unhurriedly. After pondering for a moment he advised, But we've closed the exit of Heaven Capital for 2 months, and we've decided to defend Heaven Capital. Will there be any problems if we open the exit now? Besides, Kenshin has always been cunning and unpredictable. Don't you want to reconsider? This trusted general was not only powerful but also wise and resourceful. He had been Celestial King's military advisor for many years. He was keenly aware that the current situation was a bit strange. Kenshin shouldn't have made such a low-level mistake by separating from Shifang Pavilion and sending them to the vicinity of Heaven Capital. This was like a hunter dangling a piece of fat meat in front of a tiger to test whether the tiger would dare to pounce and bite it. Therefore, the trusted general felt that this was very likely a conspiracy. However, he could not say it out loud. He could only remind the Celestial King in a roundabout way. However, the Celestial King did not care about his reminder. He was still stubborn. He sneered and said, Carefully consider what? Kenshin was still so far away from the other 4 factions. What was there to be afraid of? Kenshin has repeatedly tested my bottom line. His success in the past 2 months has not only humiliated me, it has also made him incomparably arrogant. Now 1,000 disciples of Shifeng Pavilion dare to come to the realm of green heaven and show off in front of me. If I don't decisively send troops to destroy them, when they occupy the domain chief's mansion in the realm of green heaven, I will become a complete coward. Could it be that you still want those ignorant lowly commoners to continue laughing at me? It was true that the domain chief's mansion in the realm of green heaven was only half a day away from the entrance of heaven capital. There were only 1,000 disciples of Shifeng Pavilion, but they dared to attack the domain chief's mansion. This was simply challenging the celestial king's bottom line. If he could even endure this, then he would really be a coward and a coward. Seeing the celestial king was angry, the trusted general hurriedly bowed and apologized, explaining that he did not mean to offend. The celestial king did not want to talk nonsense. He waved his sleeve and asked him to leave. The trusted general bowed and left carefully to carry out the order. However, the celestial king ignored a problem. When the 99 domains of the realm of green heaven were all occupied by the rebel alliance, the range of his intelligence force's activities was greatly reduced. Under normal circumstances, any important news that happened in the realm of green heaven could be delivered to him on the same day. But now the intelligence force's activities were limited. Only one spy was left in the illusionary sun-blessed land. As a result, the news that the celestial king just received, confirming that the Kenshin and the four forces were still in the illusionary sun-blessed land, was actually something that happened yesterday. Just last night, 4,000 elite disciples of the four forces had boarded the god-slaying battleship of the Kenshin and quietly left the illusionary sun-blessed land. The god-slaying battleship concealed its whereabouts and aura. Without alerting anyone, it embarked on the journey to the north. As for its destination, of course, it was the realm of green heaven. Of course, the specific destination was the domain chief's mansion of green heaven or heaven capital. That was unknown. As far as the celestial king and countless people knew, the illusionary sun-blessed land was 5 days away from the realm of green heaven. But the god-slaying battleship's speed was shocking. It would take at most 2 days to arrive at the realm of green heaven. In addition, the celestial king guessed that the Shifeng Pavilion alone and only 1,000 disciples dared to attack the domain chief's mansion of green heaven. It might be Kenshin's plot to test his bottom line and reaction. In fact, he guessed right. It was indeed Ji Tianxing's plan. Just as he said to the master of the illusionary sun sect a month ago, he had already thought of a follow-up plan. And the Shifeng Pavilion alone and going to the domain chief's mansion of green heaven as bait were all part of his plan. The trusted general of the celestial king was the leader of his trusted subordinates. His name was Xie Fengyi and his title was Immortal King Fengyi. He was the uncrowned military counselor. The reason why the celestial king didn't have the position of military counselor was that his vanity made trouble. It was because he felt that his wisdom was unparalleled and he could devise strategies in a tent. If he had the position of military counselor, it would make him seem brainless and not wise enough. Immortal King Fengyi had the strength of the 9th layer of the Immortal King realm. He had great prestige under the celestial king's command. Even though the dozens of domain lords and tens of thousands of soldiers were disappointed and complained about the celestial king's incompetence, but they still maintained enough respect and courtesy to Immortal King Fengyi. Immortal King Fengyi used his eloquence and prestige to explain to the many domain lords and soldiers that the news and rumors from the outside world were all Kenshin's plan to drive a wedge between them. After explaining clearly, he tried his best to comfort the tens of thousands of soldiers. In this way, the soldiers' negative and lazy mood dissipated by more than half. Although the morale was still not high, the soldiers were already thankful that they were willing to carry out the mission and patrol as usual. Immediately after, Immortal King Fengyi announced the Celestial King's order. He asked the 3 immortal generals Qi, Lu and Lu to gather 6,000 soldiers and leave Heaven Capital to kill the disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion. Just as the Celestial King expected, the soldiers could finally enter and leave Heaven Capital. There was a battle to fight. They were all excited and enthusiastically signed up. The Apex. Chapter 4303. In just half an hour, Divine Generals Qi, Lu and Lu had selected 6,000 soldiers and arranged them in formation. Divine King Fengyi held the Celestial King's token and read the order in front of everyone, sending 6,000 soldiers to battle. After saluting, the 3 divine generals and the 6,000 soldiers were full of ambition and pride as they valiantly set off. Those divine generals who didn't receive the order and soldiers who weren't selected were disappointed and envious as they watched the army set off. They had been idling in heaven capital for so long that they wanted to rush out and fight to vent their frustrations. But unfortunately, this precious opportunity was taken away by the 6,000 soldiers. Divine King Fengyi saw that the soldiers were disappointed and envious, so he comforted them. "Don't worry, everyone. Lord Tianyu has seen through Kenshin's conspiracy and has already arranged a plan. This is just the beginning of our counterattack. There will be more opportunities for you to go out and fight to your heart's content. As long as we have the initiative, we can't let Kenshin attack heaven capital. Instead, we will destroy his soldiers." Divine King Fengyi's words allowed the thousands of soldiers to see hope. They rallied their morale and regained their morale. Divine Generals Qi, Lu and Lu led the 6,000 soldiers and arrived at the exit of heaven capital with high morale. The entrance and exit that had been sealed off before was now opened by the guards who were guarding this place. Swoosh. When the 6,000 soldiers arrived, the exit of the defensive formation was opened and a magnificent light gate that was hundreds of meters high appeared in the sky. In order to show the majesty and dominance of heaven capital, even the space gate at the exit of the formation was set up so huge. The 6,000 soldiers lined up in formation and stepped through the huge light gate one by one, leaving heaven capital. Outside Tiandu in the vast and boundless sky, the 3 divine generals took out their divine ships and allowed the 6,000 soldiers to board one after another. Although it was only half a day's journey from heaven capital to Firmament Domain Chief's mansion, they couldn't let the 6,000 soldiers fly. Not only would it be too slow, but it would also consume a lot of the soldiers' strength. After a quarter of an hour, the 6,000 soldiers all boarded the divine ship and set off for Firmament Domain Chief's mansion. Throughout the entire process, nearly 1,000 guards at the entrance of Tiandu stared at the soldiers with eyes full of envy. Although the commanders of the guards were all inferior and middle divine kings, they were relaxed. However, everyone was relaxed and focused their attention on the 6,000 soldiers. No one could detect that there was an invisible figure who had concealed his aura. He brushed past the 6,000 soldiers, passed through the 100 zhang tall light gate and entered heaven capital. To be able to fly past thousands of people at such a close distance without exposing one's tracks and aura, only a peak divine king level expert would be able to do so. There was only one peak divine king in the entire firmament mainland, and that was Empyrean divine king. The invisible figure that had concealed his aura was naturally not him. Instead, it was Ji Tianxing who was riding the deity-slaying battleship and rushing to the entrance of heaven capital at the fastest speed possible. In order to reach the destination in the shortest time possible, he did not hesitate to spend resources worth tens of millions every hour to provide energy for the deity-slaying battleship, allowing it to travel 3 times faster. In this 1 day and a half, the god-slaying battleship had consumed close to 200 million god stones worth of resources. Fortunately, the god-slaying battleship had arrived 15 minutes ago. At that time, Ji Tianxing was still 100,000 li away when he detected that the exit of Tiandu had opened. 6,000 soldiers had just left Tiandu. He hurriedly put away the deity-slaying battleship and quietly approached alone. At the most suitable time, he easily sneaked into heaven capital. Without a doubt, this was another miracle. No one could believe that Kenshin, who was still in illusory sun-blessed land the day before yesterday, had actually infiltrated heaven capital today. This was too unbelievable, too preposterous. The entrance and exit of Tiandu had been closed for more than 2 months, and no one had entered or exited. Until today, when the 6,000 soldiers set out, the entrance was temporarily opened, and it only lasted for 15 minutes before closing again. How could Kenshin take advantage of such a coincidence to sneak into Tiandu? In fact, this was not a coincidence. Everything that had happened before, including the news that Celestial King had received, were all part of his plan. At present, things were developing according to his expectations, without the slightest deviation. Ji Tianxing had told the master of the illusory sun sect a long time ago. The 5 forces together only had 5,000 disciples. With such a small force, it was impossible to attack heaven capital and contend with 50,000 soldiers. If he wanted to break into heaven capital and defeat Celestial King, he could only use a trick. But the master of the illusory sun sect, like the masters of the other four forces, could not guess what kind of trick Ji Tianqing was going to use. If they knew that Ji Tianqing had sneaked into heaven capital alone and directly attacked the root of the problem, the masters of the five forces would be stunned. Obviously, the people of the five forces did not know about this. Needless to say, the people of the Shifeng Pavilion were still on their way to the main mansion of the Firmament Domain. And the people of the Illusory Sun sect, the Li tribe, the Fengxuan tribe, and the Yinguang sect had been staying in the Deity Slayer battleship. They did not know what was going on outside, nor did they know where Ji Tianqing would take them. Anyway, they were resting in the battleship and waiting for Ji Tianqing's orders at any time. The 6,000 soldiers left on the 3 deity battleships, and the defense formation of Heaven Capital was closed. At this time, Ji Tianqing had already wandered around Heaven Capital and began to investigate the military situation. He didn't tell his soldiers that he had a seemingly crazy plan to defeat Empyrean Deity King and conquer the Firmament continent. He wanted to create a miracle. Using only 5,000 elite disciples of the five forces to conquer Heaven Capital and defeat 50,000 soldiers. This plan was not only crazy but also absurd. Anyone who heard it would feel it was incredible and unbelievable. Therefore, Ji Tianqing did not tell anyone in advance, but took action directly. Of course, in order to accomplish such a heaven-defying miracle and feat, it was not something that could be achieved by risking his life. After he sneaked into Heaven Capital, he planned to understand the situation first and then make a detailed plan. The main purpose was to sow discord and destroy. First, he would make Heaven Capital chaotic, and it would be best to make tens of thousands of soldiers mutiny. When Heaven Capital was in chaos and the 50,000 soldiers lost their fighting capacity, his goal would be achieved and the miracle would come true. But this required time, patience, and more importantly, strategy and means. The 3 immortal generals Qi, Lu, and Lu led the 6,000 soldiers and rushed to the main mansion of the Firmament Domain on the deity battleship. The Firmament Domain was the most important domain among the 100 regions in the Firmament continent. The master of the domain had a very high status. Not only did he often come in and out of Heaven Capital, but he was also the favorite of the Celestial King. He was also deeply trusted and valued by the Nebula God Emperor. Therefore, when the Celestial King issued the summons 2 months ago, dozens of domain masters entered Heaven Capital, including the master of the Firmament Domain. Chapter 4304. When the Lord of Firmament Domain was ordered to go to Heaven Capital, he took away 70% of the Domain Chief's mansion's forces, which made the defense of the Domain Chief's mansion weak. However, the defense array of the Domain Chief's mansion was closed and no one was allowed to enter or leave. The remaining 2,000 guards and 3,000 servants only needed to stay in the Domain Chief's mansion. In the opinion of the Lord of Firmament Domain, if even his Domain Chief's mansion was attacked, the entire Firmament land would have fallen. In that case, even if his Domain Chief's mansion was occupied, it would not be a big deal. Moreover, the Celestial King would definitely send a large number of troops to wipe out the Kenshin forces. He would never allow that to happen. This was his idea 2 months ago. Who knew that it would come true? Although the 2,000 guards and 3,000 servants who stayed in the Domain Chief's mansion could not enter or leave the Domain Chief's mansion, they could still communicate with the outside world. They had already known that the disciples of Shifeng Pavilion of the Rebel Alliance were coming to attack the Domain Chief's mansion. Even though there were only 1,000 disciples in Shifeng Pavilion, they were led by the Pavilion Master, Deputy Pavilion Master, elders, deacons, and other God King experts. The 2,000 guards who stayed in the Domain Chief's mansion were almost all in the Sir God realm. Only a few of them were in the God King realm. The most powerful one among them was just a middle God King in the 5th degree realm. Knowing that Shifeng Pavilion was coming to attack the Domain Chief's mansion, the guards and servants who stayed in the Domain Chief's mansion were all anxious and worried. They had no choice but to ask for help from the master of the Firmament Domain. However, the Domain Chief was ordered to stay in Heaven Capital and could not come out. Naturally, he could not save them. However, the leader of the Firmament territory told the guards a piece of great news. That was, stay calm and don't panic. There were already 3 divine generals leading 6,000 troops on their way to support the Domain Chief's mansion. Upon hearing this news, the guards who had been full of worries and sleepless nights heaved a sigh of relief as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Everyone was relieved. They cheered up and stared at the entrance of the domain chief's mansion, ready to fight at any time. Anyway, under the protection of the defense array, they only needed to keep the array running and replenish its power. Even if they could only hold on for one day, the 6,000 reinforcements would arrive in half a day. Therefore, they didn't have to worry about their safety. Time passed quietly, 1 hour after another. Half a day was about to pass, but there was still no movement at the entrance of the domain chief's manor. What about the 1,000 disciples of Shifeng Pavilion? Weren't they going to attack the firmament domain chief's mansion? Why hasn't there been any movement yet? Calculating the time, they should have arrived long ago. Before this, the guards were afraid that the Shifeng Pavilion would invade. Now that reinforcements were coming, they were full of confidence, but they were afraid that the people of Shifeng Pavilion would not come. Another 2 hours passed. There was still no movement at the entrance of the domain chief's mansion. The disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion still hadn't shown up. More than 2,000 guards were in formation. After waiting for so long, they were a little impatient. However, they didn't dare to activate the grand formation and go outside to check the situation. They could only blindly guess and deduce. Just like that, before the disciples of 10 Directions Pavilion arrived, reinforcements arrived. 3 divine warships sped over from afar with dazzling lights. They arrived at the entrance of the domain chief's manor. After the divine warship came to a stop, the 6,000 soldiers flew out from the divine warship and quickly got into formation in the sky. Then, under everyone's gaze, 3 immortal generals and 30 commanders and deputy generals in the King God realm showed up. It was reasonable to say that it didn't take 6,000 soldiers to kill the 1,000 disciples of Shifeng Pavilion, let alone 30 King God realm experts. But Empyrean God King had sufficient military strength and numerous experts under his command. The 3 immortal generals, Qi, Lu and Lu, wanted to win this battle easily, so they brought so many King God realm experts with them. However, when they saw that the entrance of the firmament domain chief's mansion was calm and there was no trace of fighting, they were a little confused. They had the same idea as the guards in the domain chief's mansion. The people of Shifeng Pavilion should have arrived long ago. Why were they nowhere to be seen? The 3 immortal generals realized that something was wrong. They all frowned and hurried to discuss countermeasures through sound transmission. Soon the 3 immortal generals came up with an idea. One of the immortal generals stayed at the entrance with 2,000 soldiers. They were responsible for monitoring the situation at the entrance and contacting the guards in the domain chief's mansion. The other 2 immortal generals led 2,000 soldiers in 2 directions to search the area within a radius of 200,000 miles. The 3 immortal generals agreed that the people of Shifeng Pavilion had arrived long ago. However, they didn't launch an attack immediately out of caution. In this case, the people of Shifeng Pavilion must be hiding nearby to observe the situation and then find the right time to attack. In this case, they had to find out the people of Shifeng Pavilion and kill them all with their absolute advantage in numbers. Soon, the 6,000 soldiers divided into 3 directions to carry out their respective tasks. 2 immortal generals led the 4,000 soldiers to the east and west respectively. Immortal General Lu led 2,000 soldiers to stay where they were. He was vigilant and alert while trying to contact the guards in the domain chief's mansion. Fortunately, Immortal General Lu was careful enough. Before he set out, he had asked the domain lord for a token that allowed him to enter the domain lord's mansion and several jade slips that could be used to contact the guard commander. He sent out a message jade slip to contact the commander of the guards in the domain chief's mansion. He told him his identity and the purpose of his visit. The commander of the guards was very cautious. After some twists and turns, he confirmed Immortal General Lu's identity. Then he opened the entrance of the domain chief's mansion and welcomed Immortal General Lu in. As soon as he entered the domain chief's mansion, Immortal General Lu didn't want to waste time. He waved his hand to interrupt the greetings of the guards and asked directly, "Is there any news about the disciples of Shifeng Pavilion? Did they launch an attack before we arrived?" The commander of the guards knew the seriousness of the matter. He didn't dare to neglect and answered honestly, "Immortal General, we have been guarding in the domain chief's mansion. We haven't been attacked or received any news about the disciples of Shifeng Pavilion." Immortal General Lu's face became gloomier. He murmured to himself, "As expected, they haven't shown up or attacked. Next, we'll have to wait for the results of the other 2 immortal generals' investigation." If they can find the disciples of Shifeng Pavilion nearby, it'll be fine. If they can't, I'm afraid it'll be troublesome. The commander of the guards didn't understand the meaning of Immortal General Lu's words. When he was about to ask, Immortal General Lu turned to leave and said, "Continue to guard the entrance and exit of the domain chief's mansion. Don't make any mistakes." The commander of the guards didn't dare to say more. He could only do as he was told. Immortal General Lu left the domain chief's mansion and waited patiently in the sky. After a quarter of an hour, Immortal General Qi and Immortal General Lu returned with the army. After talking with each other, they found out that they had searched more than 200,000 miles around but didn't find any trace of the disciples of Shifeng Pavilion. This result made Immortal General Lu's face more serious. He couldn't help but whisper, "It's over. Something big is going to happen." Chapter 4305. None of the 4 battle marshals and 20 divine generals under Empyrean God King's command were mediocre. They were all outstanding talents. However, the firmament continent had been too peaceful before, so many immortal generals didn't have a chance to show their talents. For example, Immortal General Lu was a powerful and meticulous general. Seeing his reaction, Immortal Generals Qi and Lu were both stunned. They asked, "Lu, it's just the Shifeng Pavilion that didn't come. What could happen?" "Lu, we all know you're very meticulous. Can you tell us what's going on?" Divine General Lu didn't hide anything. He frowned and said, "In truth, before we set out, I already felt that this matter was rather strange. Although Kenshin is arrogant and overbearing, he is not stupid. He wouldn't be so arrogant as to make such a stupid mistake. He and the disciples of the 4 forces stayed in the illusionary sun-blessed land and let the Shifeng Pavilion attack the most dangerous firmament domain chief mansion alone? Do you think it's possible?" Immortal General Qi thought for a while and shook his head. "Yes, I think it's weird too." Immortal General Lu was still confused. He asked, "But didn't our scouts and informants figure it out? The disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion did come to the firmament domain chief mansion." Immortal General Lu waved his hand and said, "They did come to the domain chief mansion, but it doesn't mean they are going to attack it. Don't forget, the last message we received was yesterday evening. At that time, the disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion were still 20 million miles away." The 2 immortal generals were stunned when they heard this. They also felt that there was a big problem. Divine General Lu asked in confusion, "Then tell me what's going to happen?" Immortal General Lu thought for a while and lowered his voice. He said seriously, "I think it must be Kenshin's conspiracy. The disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion didn't come to attack the firmament domain chief mansion. They were just a cover. Besides, I suspect they didn't come to the domain chief mansion and hid somewhere else. We have to report this news to the Celestial King as soon as possible. We can't let our guard down or something big will happen." Divine Generals Qi and Lu were still a little confused, their faces full of doubt. "Old Lu, we trust your intuition. We also feel that this matter is a little strange. It might be a scheme by the Kenshin. However, we still don't understand why Kenshin would design such a scheme. Using 1,000 disciples of Shifeng Pavilion to disperse our forces? So that he could lead the other 4 forces to attack Tiandu? This doesn't seem possible, right?" "Yes. There are only 1,000 disciples in Shifeng Pavilion. We can easily annihilate them with 3,000 to 5,000 people. Even if our 6,000 troops left Tiandu, Tiandu still has more than 40,000 troops. Even if he opens the door and allows Kenshin to lead the disciples of the other 4 forces to attack, he is still seeking his own death." Although Divine General Lu's analysis and conjecture made Qi and Lu believe that this was the Kenshin's scheme, Qi and Lu believed that it was the Kenshin's scheme. However, the 2 of them couldn't figure out the purpose of Kenshin's scheme. Faced with the 2 Divine Generals' doubts, Divine General Lu couldn't explain clearly. He could only say in a low voice, "How can we guess what Kenshin wants to do? Anyway, I trust my intuition. This is definitely the Kenshin scheme. We must report this to the Celestial King." Divine Generals Qi and Lu also knew the seriousness of the matter. They would rather report it incorrectly than hide it. Even if they couldn't guess what Kenshin's scheme was, they believed that Divine King Fingyi and the Celestial King would know how to deal with it. Therefore, the 3 divine generals jointly sent a message jade slip to Divine King Fingyi. Then Divine King Fingyi reminded the Celestial King. After reporting the situation to their superiors, the three divine generals didn't dare to leave without permission. They could only stay at the entrance of the realm of firmament and wait for the celestial king's orders. About an hour later, divine King Fingyi sent a message back, conveying the celestial king's decree. The decree was formal and difficult to understand. However, the general meaning was clear. It was to order the three divine generals to stay outside the realm of firmament's realm of firmament and continue to be vigilant and search for the disciples of Shifang Pavilion. The celestial king already knew what they reported and would find a way to deal with it. In the future, if they could prove that their warnings were effective, the celestial king would reward them according to their merits. After receiving this reply, the three divine generals were relieved. They still acted separately, lurking at the entrance of the realm of firmament's realm of firmament and continuing to search and wait for the disciples of Shifang Pavilion. In fact, divine King Fingyi didn't need the three divine generals to remind him. When he learned that the disciples of Shifang Pavilion didn't appear and didn't attack the realm of firmament's realm of firmament, he realized that something was wrong. With his intelligence, he naturally guessed that this might be Kenshin's scheme. However, like the three divine generals, he couldn't figure out what Kenshin wanted to do no matter how hard he tried to analyze and figure it out. Therefore, he reported the news to the Celestial King and asked the Celestial King to make the decision. Unfortunately, the Celestial King couldn't figure out the reason or figure out Kenshin's plan and goal after pondering for a long time. In short, he and more than 40,000 soldiers guarded Heaven Capital and closed the entrance. It was as impregnable as a fortress. No matter what tricks Kenshin wanted to play, he would eventually attack Heaven Capital and fight against 40,000 soldiers. He couldn't lose. At this moment, the 1,000 disciples of Shifang Pavilion had already bypassed the realm of firmament's realm of firmament and were heading for Heaven Capital. Of course, they didn't come to attack Heaven Capital. Even if the Shifang Pavilion master led a team of 1,000 elite disciples, attacking the realm of firmament's realm of firmament by force was just a stopgap. They were just following Ji Tianxing's order to lurk near Heaven Capital and wait for further orders. As long as they could hide their tracks well and not be discovered by anyone, they would complete the task perfectly. The Shifang Pavilion master and the elders didn't quite understand why Kenshin gave such an order. But since Kenshin didn't explain, they didn't dare to ask and just did as they were told. On the other hand, after Ji Tianxing sneaked into Heaven Capital, he spent half a day to figure out the layout of defense and the distribution of troops in Heaven Capital. The 44,000 soldiers were composed of dozens of forces and scattered in different locations. Dozens of realm masters and more than 300 King of God realm experts were guarding there. There were also more than 8,000 servants and maids who were settled there. As well as the topography of Heaven Capital, where were the buildings, where were the underground palaces and secret chambers. Ji Tianxing figured it all out. After everything was ready, he didn't waste any time and immediately started to act. At this time, he had already taken over the body of a low-rank god king. This low-rank god king was the deputy of Realm Master Xenlun, which was the deputy realm master. His status wasn't high, but it wasn't too high. He wouldn't attract too much attention, but he could play a corresponding role. The Apex. Chapter 4306. This unlucky deputy region master was quietly killed by Ji Tianxing while he was still resting in his residence. Ji Tianxing had destroyed his godhead and refined his divine soul's memories, thus obtaining the information he wanted. At the same time, he also knew that tens of thousands of soldiers had almost mutinied a few days ago. This gave him more confidence and more means and opportunities to plunge Tiandu into chaos. This deputy region master followed the Exen and region master to Tiandu with more than 2,000 elite guards. There were 4 other region masters who had a good relationship with them and were secretly in cahoots. Since there were good relationships, there were naturally bad ones. 2 of the region masters had some enmity and grudges with them because of some friction and conflicts. However, everyone stayed in Tiandu under the eyes of the Celestial King, so they could only pretend to be harmonious and mind their own business. At this moment, a messenger guard came to his residence and reported a piece of news to him. "Sir, those fellows from the pleasure region have taken over our posts and will be replaced now." Not all of the 40,000 soldiers were carrying out their missions. Usually they were divided into 2 groups and took turns to guard and patrol. This ensured that the soldiers were full of energy and could use their full strength at any time when war broke out. The two groups of soldiers had a deadline of 5 days and had to be replaced every 5 days. In the past few days, more than 2,000 people under the deputy region master had been on duty. They would only be replaced by the people from the pleasure region at midnight tonight. It was reasonable to say that the people from the pleasure region were a little anxious because they were 8 hours early. However, in the past 2 months, Tiandu had been dull and boring without any disturbances. The guards and soldiers had been impatient to rest all day long. Previously, every time the guards were replaced, the people from the pleasure region came a few hours early and the deputy region master did not say anything and the handover went smoothly. In addition, 6,000 soldiers had been deployed in the past 2 days. The Celestial King had begun his counterattack. As long as the soldiers were on duty, they could receive orders to carry out combat-type missions at any time. The people from the pleasure region obviously wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fight for more opportunities to go to war and gain merits. After the messenger guard reported, he thought that the deputy region master would order the soldiers to take over and change the defense like before. However, he did not expect that the deputy region master in front of him had already changed. Ji Tianxing furrowed his brows and scolded angrily, "You bastards from the Joy Realm, did you take my tolerance and kindness as a habit? Do they think that I'm afraid of them? Who didn't know what they were planning? Do you think we're fools? I've already tolerated you so many times, but this time I definitely won't. Go and tell the people of the pleasure domain to scram and not appear before the appointed time." Ah! The messenger guard did not expect the deputy region master to be so angry and say such tough words. Of course he was a little confused. He hesitated and asked tentatively, "Sir, do I really have to answer them like that?" Ji Tianxing glared at him and scolded, "You coward, are you afraid of them?" The messenger guard shrank back in fright. He didn't dare to speak any more nonsense. He hurriedly bowed and said, "This subordinate understands. Sir, please rest assured that this subordinate will convey your message truthfully." After that, the messenger guard ran away like a wisp of smoke. Ji Tianxing got up and went to the study. He asked the maidservant to make a pot of tea. Then he leisurely reclined in the armchair and waited for the follow-up. He had already spread out his divine sense to observe the situation around him. He stared at his subordinates and the people of the Joy Realm. He could clearly tell that when the messenger guard relayed his words to the people of the Happy Realm, the expressions on their faces had been marvelous. What happened next was also within his expectations. The vice domain master of Joy Realm and his many guards were naturally enraged by the humiliation and started a conflict with the soldiers under his command. Both sides cursed and ridiculed each other. No one was willing to back down, so shoving and fighting broke out. Although no one was killed, dozens of people from both sides were injured. Most of them were lightly injured, but a few people were seriously injured. It was very miserable. Of course, the matter was blown out of proportion. The deputy region master of the Joy Realm hurriedly called for their region master to calm the situation. The messenger guard ran to Ji Tianxing and reported what had happened. Ji Tianxing was furious when he heard this. He angrily reprimanded the people of the Joy Realm for being presumptuous and lawless. His subordinates were still on duty, but the other party dared to attack them. They had gone too far. He immediately asked the messenger guard to report to the region master of the Xianxia region. He also contacted a few region masters who were on good terms with him to support them. After a while, the region master of the Xianxia region ran to Ji Tianxing and angrily asked him what had happened. Ji Tianxing's anger hadn't subsided yet, so he described the actions of those people from the realm of happiness to Nya Tian with exaggerated details. Although the region master of the Xianxia region felt that something was wrong, he didn't think too much about it because they had a common enemy. When he learned that Ji Tianxing had contacted a few other region masters to support them and reason with the other party, the region master of the Xianxia region agreed wholeheartedly. Moreover, he advised earnestly, "We are going to launch our counterattack soon. Now is a crucial moment. We must not cause any trouble. I know that you are regretful and angry that the 3 divine generals did not choose us when they led their troops to battle. However, you did not show any emotion and could still remain calm. Let the other 4 region masters be the judge. Then I can rest assured." Ji Tianxing quickly said, "That's right. We are an elite army. We have sacrificed our lives for the Celestial King. How loyal are we to the Celestial King? How can we let those bastards from the Joy Realm bully us? This is absolutely intolerable. However, I will not have a conflict with them. I will only let the other region masters be the judge. If we can't explain it clearly, we will ask Divine King Fingy to be the judge. The region master of the Xian region quickly waved his hand and persuaded, "Don't. It's best if we can settle this privately. Don't disturb Divine King Fingy." Ji Tianxing nodded to show that he understood. The region master of the Xian region was still a little worried. He decided to go to the scene personally. Ji Tianxing followed him. However, a mocking sneer flashed across his eyes. The two of them left the courtyard they lived in. They had only flown 1,000 miles when the messenger guard rushed towards them with a flustered look on his face. The region master of the Xian region's heart skipped a beat. He had a premonition that the situation was not good. He quickly stopped the guard and asked, "Why are you so flustered?" With a sullen face, the messenger guard replied with an embarrassed expression, "Domain Lord, the other 4 domain lords have brought their men here to judge and uphold justice for us. But we didn't expect the bastards from the Joy domain to be so unforgiving. They slandered us and insisted that we bullied them with numbers. The other commanders were furious and started fighting with them again. The 4 domain lords were also affected and everyone was swept up in it. So, the 5 of us joined forces and defeated all the people from the Joy realm." Chapter 4307. And region lord was afraid that things would get out of hand. When he heard this news, his vision went black and he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Ji Tianxing was not surprised by this because this was part of his prediction and plan to begin with. Both sides had just fought a battle and were still angry and impulsive. At this time they called for the help of the 4 region lords. Even if they wanted to reason with them, the region lord would think that they were bullying them with numbers. Therefore there was nothing for both sides to talk about. It was inevitable that there would be a conflict. When their own guards were beaten up, the 4 region lords who were on good terms with them could not just stand by and watch. They would definitely intervene and stop the fight. Since they had intervened, they would definitely be involved. Once the situation became chaotic and both sides were filled with anger, a chaotic battle was unavoidable. However, Ji Tianxing was more concerned about, defeated all of them? Did he injure them? Or killed them? This was a crucial question that determined the severity of the problem. The messenger guard's face turned even uglier. He was so anxious that he was about to cry. 90% of the people from the region lord were seriously injured by us. More than 200 people were killed in the chaotic battle. Xian region lord, who had just regained his senses, heard this news again. His vision turned black again and he really spat out a mouthful of old blood. "Pfft, we're finished. Lives have been lost. There's no way to clean up this mess." Ji Tianxing sneered in his heart. On the surface he had to comfort Xian region lord. He said confidently, "Don't worry, region lord. It was the people from the region lord's fault. They were the ones who were unreasonable. The 4 region lords can testify for us. Don't worry, God King Fingy will definitely clear our names." Xian region lord was so angry that he could not speak. At this point the news could not be hidden anymore. God King Fingy would probably receive the news soon and go to deal with this matter. Therefore Xian region lord sped up and rushed to the scene of the incident. When he arrived at the scene with Ji Tianxing, he realized that there were new changes to the situation. The scene of the incident was originally on a mountain peak surrounded by forests. However, the previous battle had flattened the mountain and the 20,000 miles of forest had turned into ruins. More than 2,000 guards from the Joy realm were lying on the ground in disarray. The guards were all covered in blood and in a sorry state. They kept howling in pain. There were over 1,000 people who were trying their best to endure their injuries and treat their companions who were even more severely injured. Most of Ji Tianxing's 2,000 guards were safe and sound. Only a few of them were injured. As for the 4 area masters, they had only brought 200 to 300 guards with them. In total there were only about 1,000 people and there were not many casualties. Logically speaking, since the people of the pleasure domain had been taught a lesson and ended up in such a miserable state, they should have been obedient. However, both the domain master and the deputy domain master were injured. They were so angry that they almost went berserk. How could they swallow their anger? When Ji Tianxing and Xian territorial lord arrived, Shui Lu and the deputy territorial lord saw them and could not hold back their anger. No matter how good-tempered Exin and Region Master was, he still frowned after being scolded. His face was as dark as the bottom of a pot. However, he tried his best to restrain his anger and did not explode. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was filled with righteous indignation. He fiercely retaliated and scolded the other party. Of course, the people of the pleasure domain were not in the right. They could not fight back after being scolded. However, his words, "You deserve to be beaten. A bunch of lawless bastards. It's best if you die," made the people of the pleasure domain go crazy. Obviously, this sentence was like adding fuel to the fire. It intensified the conflict between the two sides and made them hate each other to the max. The Shui Lu and the Deputy Territorial Lord were so angry that they vomited blood. They glared at Ji Tianxing and Exin and Region Master with bloodshot eyes and said something like, "We will never give up, and we will never live under the same sky." At this moment, another 5 territorial lords, each with a few hundred guards, arrived above the ruins. The 5 domain lords were all called over by Domain Lord Qialu to help uphold justice. They had a very good relationship with him and were very close friends. More importantly, 2 of the territorial lords had a feud with Exin and Region Master. There had always been conflicts between them. Seeing that the 5 territorial lords had brought more than 3,000 guards, Shuele felt more confident with helpers. He recounted what had happened. Naturally, he cut the beginning and the end of the story and exaggerated the details. He described the guards of the Joy domain as innocent, and Ji Tianxing's side as guilty of the most heinous crimes. Moreover, the more than 2,000 people of the pleasure domain were in such a miserable state. More than 200 of them had died. The 5 territorial lords believed his story without a doubt. They angrily condemned Exin and Region Master Ji Tianxing and the others. Just like this, the two sides were divided into 2 factions. They attacked, slandered, and cursed each other. The situation became tense again. Both sides had the same number of people. They both felt that they were in the right and that the other side was guilty of the most heinous crimes. Therefore, no one was willing to back down. Even if some of the territorial lords came to help, they could still maintain their rationality. They advised everyone not to be too agitated and not to make a big deal out of it. However, Ji Tianxing was at the scene. He could make the people of the pleasure domain go crazy with just a few words. If it really didn't work, he could take advantage of the time when both sides were pushing and blaming each other to secretly kill a few of the guards of the other side. Just like this, the conflict between the two sides intensified again. No one could persuade or stop them. They started fighting again in the ruins. There were more than 3,000 people on both sides. Moreover, they were fighting with real weapons. The power was terrifying. When the chaos reached its peak, even the 10 territorial lords from both sides made a move. They were divided into 2 factions and fought fiercely. In just a few minutes, the ruins had expanded to 50,000 miles. Shouts of killing shook the sky. Both sides also suffered a large number of casualties. At this crucial moment, someone in the crowd suddenly shouted, "Divine King Feng Yi is here." Hearing the shout of a certain territorial lord, the battle paused for a moment. Thousands of people from both sides turned to look. As expected, in the sky 20,000 miles away, Divine King Feng Yi was rushing over angrily with 3,000 silver-armored forbidden guards. Once they saw Divine King Feng Yi and the silver-armored forbidden guards, many soldiers were terrified. They didn't dare to fight anymore. However, how could Ji Tianxing let the battle stop? Taking advantage of this opportunity, he struck again and killed more than 10 guards in an instant. He even chopped off the arms of a deputy region master. The people of the pleasure domain reacted. They were unable to restrain their anger. They cursed words like treacherous and despicable. They then started to attack the people of the Exin region. Even when Divine King Feng Yi brought the silver-armored forbidden guards to the battlefield and surrounded both sides didn't have any intention to stop. Seeing this, Divine King Feng Yi became even more furious. He shouted with a dignified voice to stop. Unexpectedly, Ji Tianxing hid in the chaotic crowd and used some methods. He caused countless sharp blades of divine light to shoot towards the silver-armored forbidden guards. Especially the people of the pleasure domain. They released their divine arts and secret arts. They strangely changed directions and smashed towards the forbidden guards. Book guest residence reading website. Chapter 4308. The battlefield was chaotic to begin with, so it was not surprising for anything to happen. Even if someone attacked the silver-armored Imperial Guards, everyone would be shocked, but they would not be surprised. As for the Imperial Guards, they were naturally filled with anger and killing intent as they fought back. They had been guarding the divine capital for many years and were the Imperial Guards under the Celestial King. How noble was their status? To put it simply, they were the direct subordinates of the Celestial King. As for the thousands of soldiers in front of them, they were merely the subordinates of the various vassals. Facing the territorial lords, the Imperial Guards were very reserved and proud. As for the soldiers from the various territories, they were even more superior and did not look them in the eye. Therefore, the silver-armored Imperial Guards were enraged. They mercilessly waved their weapons and used all sorts of divine abilities to kill those who had mistakenly injured them. Under the deliberate control of Zhi Tianxing, the attacks released by the silver-armored Imperial Guards were scattered in the crowd and indiscriminately attacked many people. No matter if it was the soldiers from Xian region or Qialu region, they were all mercilessly attacked. Although the silver-armored Imperial Guards did not feel any guilt in their eyes, these soldiers were all rebels and traitors. But to the thousands of soldiers, the silver-armored Imperial Guards were indiscriminately killing people. It was truly abominable. As the chaos became more and more intense, more silver-armored Imperial Guards attacked and killed those soldiers who dared to resist. The soldiers did not differentiate between friend and foe. At this moment, they actually put down the conflict between the two territories and joined forces to resist the silver-armored Imperial Guards. Seeing this scene, God King Fengyi almost exploded in anger. He originally brought the silver-armored Imperial Guards to calm the chaos, but before he could even speak, the silver-armored Imperial Guards were dragged into the battle and it became a three-sided chaotic battle. What the F***ck was this? There were casualties on all three sides. Even more than 100 silver-armored Imperial Guards were mistakenly killed. God King Fengyi knew that if he did not use forceful means to calm the chaos, he would be held accountable. Territorial Lord Xian and Territorial Lord Qialu, and all of you, Divine King Fengyi cast a sealing divine formation to seal off the area within 30,000 miles, forcefully suppressing the thousands of soldiers while calling out the names of the domain lords. Those few domain lords were called out and naturally, they didn't dare to fight as they stared intently at God King Fengyi. God King Fengyi's heart was filled with anger as he angrily ordered, "No matter what the reason is that caused you to fight, I order you all to immediately stop your subordinates. If you refuse to come to your senses, then don't blame me for being impolite and annihilating all of you." Seeing that God King Fengyi was truly enraged, killing intent flashed in his eyes. Those domain lords who came to help and support the situation immediately cowered. "Yes, sir. Don't worry, my lord. I will give the order now." Several domain lords gave orders for their soldiers to stop fighting and retreat to the edge of the battlefield. However, Domain Master Xuelu was the one who suffered the most. Not only were more than 2,000 of his guards crippled, but he was also ambushed by Zhi Tianxing. He was severely injured and even lost both of his legs. He was so enraged that he was on the verge of going berserk. His mind wasn't clear anymore. "God King Fengyi, I can listen to your orders, but you have to ask the bastards of Xian and region to stop first." Hearing this, Xian and region lord was unhappy. He cursed angrily, "Domain Master Xuelu, who are you scolding? Did I not teach you enough of a lesson? Do you want me to annihilate all of your men before you will be obedient?" Zhi Tianxing added fuel to the fire and added, "Domain Master Xuelu has gone mad. He is now a mad dog that will bite anyone he sees. Everyone be careful." His voice was neither loud nor soft, but it was heard clearly by many divine kings. Domain Master Xuelu already hated Zhi Tianxing to the core. He was instantly enraged. He didn't care about God King Fengyi's presence. His eyes were bloodshot as he roared and charged towards Zhi Tianxing with his divine blade. Even though Zhi Tianxing could kill Domain Master Xuelu with a casual move. On the surface, Domain Master Xuelu was a 6th Heaven Realm Intermediate Divine King, while he was only a 3rd Heaven Realm Lower Divine King. Therefore he had to show his fear. He retreated and ran away in a panic. Coincidentally, in his panic, he lost his composure and ran towards a group of silver-armored Imperial Guards. Bam bam bam. Domain Master Xuelu used all his strength to perform his ultimate skill and hit more than 200 Imperial Guards. Those unlucky fellows were injured on the spot. More than 40 of them were killed. How arrogant were the silver-armored Imperial Guards. They were usually arrogant. Now that they were injured one after another, how could they take it lying down? There was no need for God King Fengyi to give the order. The silver-armored Imperial Guards joined forces to perform their skills and besiege Domain Master Xuelu. Looking at their stance, they would only stop when they killed Domain Master Xuelu on the spot. Since Domain Master Xueli's life was in danger, how could the deputy Domain Masters and more than 1,000 soldiers ignore it? They were originally Domain Master Xueli's retainers. They were not under the control of the Imperial Guards and God King Fengyi. If they were asked who they were most loyal to, it would undoubtedly be Domain Master Xuelu. Just like this, the chaos that had been suppressed with much difficulty erupted again. Domain Master Xuelu and the Imperial Guards started fighting. Blood splattered everywhere and miserable cries were heard. However, the people from the other domains had learned their lesson. They retreated silently and did not dare to interfere. Especially the people from Xianxia region. They were all gloating. God King Fengyi also had a headache. He hated Domain Master Xuelu, Domain Master Xianxia and Ji Tianxing to the core. Especially Ji Tianxing. God King Fengyi was meticulous. Naturally, he could guess that Ji Tianxing seemed to be running away in a panic, but he was actually trying to divert the trouble. To put it simply, this fellow purposely provoked Domain Master Xuelu and made him attack the silver-armored Imperial Guards. If it was during normal times, God King Fengyi would not be disgusted by the Domain Masters under his command. It would not be a problem if it was used on the enemy. However, it was used on the Imperial Guards and in his hands. He had his eyes on Ji Tianxing. No matter what, he would not forgive Ji Tianxing. As for the 2,000 Imperial Guards working together to kill the people from Domain Master Xuelu, God King Fengyi saw that what was done could not be undone. He did not say anything to stop it. He was a decisive and ruthless person. He knew that Domain Master Xuelu and Xianxia region were the source of the chaos. If he did not eliminate one of them, it would be hard to calm the chaos. Since Domain Master Xuelu was more reckless and crazy, then he would eliminate the people from Domain Master Xuelu. It was their bad luck. The facts proved that God King Fengyi's method was very effective. The Imperial Guards had the advantage in numbers and their average strength was higher than the people from Domain Master Xuelu. Furthermore, God King Fengyi had personally taken action. In a short 15 minutes, the people from Domain Master Xuelu were all killed. Only the Deputy Domain Master survived and was captured by God King Fengyi. Even Domain Master Xuelu was killed by God King Fengyi because he was too crazy and had lost his mind. Peak. Chapter 4309. There was only one person left from Joy region. And this Deputy Region Lord was the one who had experienced the entire incident. From the beginning of the conflict he had been present, so God King Fengyi had spared his life. Everyone, tie yourselves up and be escorted by the Imperial Guards to Capital God Palace to await your punishment. Apparently, God King Fengyi had quelled the chaos and wanted to escort everyone to be interrogated. The various region lords and soldiers looked at each other in dismay and hesitated for a while, but none of them were willing to bind themselves. Of the 3,000 Imperial Guards, only 2,500 remained and most of them were injured. These Imperial Guards had learned to be smart and no longer forcefully captured everyone. Instead they looked on coldly with imposing manner. God King Fengyi flew into a rage again and used his 9th Heaven Realm God King's imposing manner to intimidate the various region lords. Therefore those region lords could only submit obediently. The various region soldiers all tied themselves up and obediently lined up before being escorted out of the ruins by the Imperial Guards. A group of thousands of people flew across the sky and headed straight for Capital God Palace, which was 100,000 miles away. This scene was naturally seen by many region lords and soldiers. Of course, dozens of region lords and tens of thousands of soldiers had already received the news and knew about the conflict and killing between Xianxia region and Joy region. When they saw the prisoners being escorted and discovered that only Joy region's deputy region lord was among them and there were no other Joy region soldiers, many of them smelled the scent of danger. Especially those region lords who were more astute, they immediately guessed that Joy region's people were all killed. It's just a conflict between the two regions' soldiers and a chaotic brawl. Joy region's people were all killed? Heavens! Things have become so serious? Joy Region's 2,000 over people, were they killed by Exen and Region's people or were they killed by God King Feng Yi? Looks like this matter has gotten out of hand. I wonder how Celestial King will deal with them. God King Empyrean, God King Fengyi, and those arrogant imperial guards don't care about our lives at all. Our territories and caves were invaded but they were indifferent. Now that there's a brawl between the two regions, God King Fengyi actually killed all the soldiers in one region. What vicious means? Stop guessing. Since you know that they don't care about our lives, then keep your mouths shut. Everyone be careful. Don't make any mistakes at this critical juncture. For a time, many domain lords and soldiers were discussing this matter in private. The massacre of the Joy Domain's people made the soldiers of many other domains fall silent out of fear. They felt like the fox mourning the death of the hare. Today God King Fengyi could casually kill everyone in Joy Region. Tomorrow if they committed any mistakes, God King Fengyi could also kill them all. How could they not be afraid? Not long after, several thousand criminals were escorted out of the Heavenly God Palace. Capital Heaven Divine Palace, which occupied an area of 10,000 feet, stood at the peak of a huge mountain. It was very majestic and had a majestic aura. Even though the Celestial King, who had already received the news, was sitting in the council hall, full of anger, waiting for the trial of the sinners who had made mistakes. However, God King Fengyi had captured thousands of people and it was impossible for all of them to enter the main hall. Therefore, the soldiers of the various domains stayed in the plaza outside the Heavenly God Palace and silently waited for their punishment. All the domain lords, deputy domain lords, and commanders followed God King Fengyi into the council hall. There were more than 40 people and they stood in 2 rows in the hall. The God King experts on the left row were from the 5 factions led by the Exen and Domain Lord. The God King experts on the right row were from the 4 domain lords who supported the Joy region. Even when they were in the council hall, standing under the eyes of the Celestial King, both parties were glaring at each other with deep enmity. This scene made the Celestial King extremely angry. His face and eyes turned gloomy. God King Fengyi, why don't you tell me what happened? After everyone bowed and paid their respects, the Celestial King lifted his wide sleeves and asked in a dignified tone. God King Fengyi quickly stood in the middle of the hall and briefly explained the cause and process of the incident. He was considered fair and impartial. His position and attitude were impartial as he explained the situation truthfully. After hearing this, the Celestial King already had a plan in mind and asked for the details. There were many questions regarding the details. God King Fengyi was not an eyewitness and naturally could not answer. Therefore, the Deputy Domain Lord of the Joy region Zhou Xian and many other commanders all needed to answer. As for the Deputy Domain Lord of the Joy region, he was naturally furious. He hated the people of the Exen and region to the core and described them as heinous beyond redemption. Zhou Xian and the commanders of the Exen and region were no exception. They pushed all the blame to the Joy region. Both parties started arguing in the hall and attacked each other. Zhou Xian's side had the advantage in numbers. The Deputy Domain Lord of the Joy region was alone and was quickly defeated. He was so angry that he could only vomit blood. Seeing the noisy and foul atmosphere in the hall, the Celestial King slammed the table angrily. After everyone quieted down, he announced the results of the trial. There was no doubt that it was the usual method used by the superiors. Both sides will be punished 50 times. The Joy region made the mistake first and should be punished severely. However, the Joy region lord and his subordinates were all killed. They had already paid a terrible price, so they did not pursue the matter further. The Deputy Domain Lord of the Joy region was pardoned and ordered to return to his residence to recuperate. He was also grounded for 10 years. As for the Exen and region, from the Domain Lord to the Deputy Domain Lord, and more than 2,000 soldiers under his command, they were all severely punished. The Exen and region soldiers were punished with 200 Thunder God's whips, regardless of casualties. The Domain Lord and Deputy Domain Lord did not supervise well and were punished with 200 Thunder God's whips. They were also punished with 300 Thunder God's whips in the Heaven Punishment Sword formation. In addition, all the Domain Lords and soldiers who helped support and participated in this chaotic battle were also severely punished. To put it simply, the Celestial King wanted to make an example of them to intimidate the people of the other regions. After the series of sentences were announced, There was an uproar among the domain lords in the hall. The deputy domain lord of the Joy region was relieved and secretly rejoiced in others' misfortune. As for the Exin and region lord Ji Tianxing and the others, their reactions were very intense and resistant. First of all, more than 2,000 people from the Exin and region were seriously injured. The Divine Lord Realm soldiers were already seriously injured. After receiving 200 Thunder God's whips, they would be crippled even if they did not die. As for the Exin and region lord and Ji Tianxing, they received 200 Thunder God's whips and 300 Thunder God's whips. Of course they would not die, but they would be crippled. The other domain lords and soldiers would also be severely injured after receiving the punishment. It would be difficult for them to recover within 10 years. In this way, in the following battle with the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance, these people would not have the chance to fight and contribute. How could they be willing to accept the punishment? All the domain lords were in an uproar. They begged for mercy and asked the Celestial King to reduce the punishment. Ji Tianxing argued emotionally but was sternly reprimanded by the Celestial King. Therefore he rushed out of the hall in a fit of anger, ran to the square and committed suicide in front of everyone. The Guest House Reading website. Chapter 43:10. When Ji Tianxing rushed out of the main hall and flew into the sky above the square, everyone was stunned. Celestial King Feng Yi and the other zone leaders in the main hall were all stunned. No one had expected that a mere deputy zone leader would be so audacious as to defy the Celestial King's decision to punish him. Moreover, the Joy region had already paid a terrible price. Other than the deputy zone leader, the entire army had been wiped out. As one of the main culprits, it was reasonable for the Exin and region to receive such a punishment from the Celestial King. What was so unacceptable about it? As for the thousands of soldiers in the square, they were all stunned on the spot. They all stayed in the square, anxiously waiting for the results of the trial. Unexpectedly, before the Celestial King's trial was over, they saw the Exin and Deputy Zone leader fly out and commit suicide in the sky in front of everyone. Most importantly, before the Exin and Deputy Zone leader committed suicide, his face was full of anger. His tone was very sullen and he unwillingly shouted a few words. "We have been wronged." The Celestial King did not distinguish between right and wrong. He did not care about the lives of our soldiers. He did not treat us as human beings at all. He asked Feng Yi to kill everyone in the Joy region, and now he wants to kill all the soldiers in the Exin and region. I will not accept this. I would rather die than accept this. After shouting these words, Ji Tianxing raised his hand and slammed it on the top of his head in front of everyone. Almost everyone heard a crisp crack sound. Then he bled from his 7 orifices and died on the spot. His intact body fell from the sky and landed on the square with a plop, causing countless soldiers to retreat to avoid it. Then the square fell into silence. Everyone was stunned and dumbfounded. The words that Ji Tianxing shouted before he committed suicide still reverberated between heaven and earth. Not only did the experts in the Heavenly Palace and the soldiers in the square hear it, even the other zone leaders and soldiers within a radius of 10,000 miles heard it clearly. For a moment, everyone was deeply shocked. They could not believe this result. What shocked everyone was that Exin and Deputy Region Leader was so bold as to challenge the Celestial King. However, when everyone thought about it, if the Exin and Deputy Region Lord was not even afraid of death, what else was there to be afraid of? As they understood this, countless soldiers couldn't help but have the same thought. How ruthless was the Celestial King that he had forced Deputy Region Master Exin into a dead end. Also, the words that Exin and Deputy Region Lord had shouted before he committed suicide were also full of anger and unwillingness. Those who heard them trembled and felt stifled. Almost all of the soldiers could feel the grievance and anger of Deputy Region Master Exin. They could empathize with him. After a moment of silence, the thousands of soldiers in the square burst into a torrent of exclamations and discussions. The domain lords and soldiers of the surrounding domains also began to discuss this matter and spread the news. Celestial King Feng Yi, and the others were stunned for a moment before they calmed down. Many of the domain lords and deputy region masters looked embarrassed. Their expressions were complicated. Regardless of their relationship with the Exin and deputy region master, after witnessing with their own eyes how unyielding the Exin and Deputy Region Master was and how he would rather commit suicide than compromise, Everyone felt respect for him. At the same time, like Exin and Deputy Region Leader, they were also dissatisfied with the Celestial King. Especially the words that Exin and Deputy Region Leader had said before he died, they were deeply impressed. Everyone understood that without the lips the teeth would feel cold. Today the entire Sheila region had been killed, and Exin and Deputy Region Leader had been forced to commit suicide. If no one stood up to resist and the Celestial King continued to do as he pleased, the next ones to be killed would be them. Thinking of this, many of the domain lords and deputy region masters felt even more resentment and hatred for the Celestial King. Celestial King Fengyi's expression was very ugly. He knew very well that Exin and Deputy Region Leader had used his death to show his sincerity. By committing suicide in public, it would cause a huge commotion and bring about negative effects. Although in his opinion the punishment that the Celestial King had given to the soldiers of Exin and region was not too excessive, it could only be called severe. However, Exin and Deputy Region Leader had committed suicide in public and shouted a slogan of resistance before he died. This would change the mood of the matter. When the tens of thousands of soldiers heard the news, they would definitely sympathize with the weak in their own kind. They would all think that the Celestial King was too cruel and did not care about their lives. If the tens of thousands of soldiers were disloyal and held a grudge against the Celestial King, then this war would be lost without a fight. Thinking of this, Celestial King Fengyi was filled with regret. He only regretted that he had not acted in time to stop Exin and Deputy Region Leader from committing suicide. However, no one had expected Exin and Deputy Region Leader to be so bold and unyielding. No one had expected such a thing to happen. Not only him, even the Celestial King was stunned and could not react. Sigh. At this point Celestial King Fengyi also felt a headache. There was no way to solve this problem. He could only sigh silently. As for the Celestial King, he was still sitting high on the throne. He stared at the square outside the palace with a gloomy expression. He definitely would not have the slightest bit of regret, let alone feel guilty. At this moment, there was only anger in his heart. Exin and Deputy Region Leader was so bold and did not care about him at all. This proved that he had no authority in the hearts of the other region leaders and generals. The loyalty and respect that the other region leaders had for him was pitifully low. How could he not be angry? As the saying goes, if the king wants his subject to die, the subject must die. You region leaders and deputy region leaders were all appointed by me. This prince appreciates and thinks highly of you, giving you noble statuses and great power. In the end, not only did you not respect and be loyal to me, you even dared to go against me. You would rather die than slander and frame me. After such a thing happened, how would the other region leaders view me? How would the tens of thousands of soldiers criticize me? How despicable. Even though Exin and Deputy Region Leader had already committed suicide, the Celestial King was still furious. He still wanted to cut him into pieces and grind his bones to dust to vent his anger. However, although the Celestial King was angry, he did not lose his mind. He knew very well that if he really gave the order to grind Exin and Deputy Region Leader's bones to dust, the tens of thousands of soldiers would be even more disappointed and completely give up on him. That would only make things worse. After calming down and considering, the Celestial King said in a low voice, "The punishment that I announced was completely in accordance with the laws set by the God Emperor. It is absolutely reasonable." Exin and Deputy Region Leader had rebellious thoughts and lost his mind to do such a thing. I am extremely disappointed. In addition, this person's usual nature is not like this. Now that he is so extreme, it is most likely that he was instigated and provoked by someone. Celestial King Fengyi, I order you to investigate this matter and find out who instigated and misled the soldiers. Hearing this, Celestial King Fengyi heaved a sigh of relief. Knowing that the Celestial King had restrained his anger and made the safest and most appropriate decision, he was deeply gratified. Therefore he quickly bowed and said, "Rest assured, my lord, I will definitely investigate and find out the real reason. I will definitely not let the soldiers be misled and instigated." Chapter 43:11. The Celestial King's words were directed at the various zone lords. Later he would announce it to the entire Tiandu so that tens of thousands of soldiers would know. Therefore his words were concise and clear, indicating his attitude. But Divine King Fingyi was very clear that there were unspoken words. First, no matter how the Celestial King punished the soldiers, it represented the will of the Nebula God Emperor. The soldiers had no right to criticize or resist. Second, the Exan and Deputy Region Lord's behavior was a little abnormal, not in line with his usual behavior. Divine King Fingyi had to investigate. He had to find out if the Exan and Deputy Region Lord was instigated by someone or if there were other reasons. Third, no matter what the soldiers thought, even if they were filled with righteous indignation, had a common enemy and hated the Celestial King. This matter had to be determined as the soldiers were misled and instigated. Divine King Fingyi only needed to find some scapegoats, put the crime of instigation on them and get rid of them. In short, the Celestial King really did not care about the lives of the soldiers. It was not a big deal if 1 or 1,000 died. He only needed the soldiers to loyally obey his orders. If Divine King Fingyi could guess the Celestial King's unspoken words, he naturally had the ability to complete these tasks. Therefore, the Celestial King withdrew from the main hall and left leisurely. Divine King Fingyi stayed behind to supervise the various zone lords and soldiers as they went to the torture chamber to receive their punishment. The 10 zone lords had mixed feelings, especially the Exan and Deputy Region Lord, who was suffering in his heart. The thousands of soldiers who participated in the battle were also silent along the way. If it was in the past when they were being punished in the torture chamber, they would definitely be screaming in pain. But what was strange was that this time, whether it was the zone lords or the soldiers, they were all silently receiving their punishment and were carried away by their comrades. Of course, there were also many soldiers who were already seriously injured who could not withstand the torture and fainted on the spot or had their divine bodies destroyed. However, they still didn't cry out or beg for mercy. They only swept their gazes with incomparable hatred and resentment at the people in the torture hall who were carrying out the punishment. Silent hatred was the scariest. Silence did not represent fear. These domain masters and soldiers who had been tortured were only temporarily swallowing their anger. However, in their hearts they had given up on Celestial King and Celestial King Fingyi. The so-called loyalty had also vanished into thin air. Of course, they were still in Tiandu and could not betray the Celestial King. But if they were allowed to leave Tiandu, that might not be the case. After the thousands of soldiers received their punishment, nearly half of them fell into a coma. A few of them had their divine bodies crippled and dozens of them died on the spot. Those who could still move returned to their residences to recuperate. Those who could not move were dragged and carried by the silver-armored imperial guards. They were like goods being transported back to their station. This scene was witnessed by many territorial lords and soldiers of various regions. Seeing the tragic fate of the punished soldiers, then looking at the murderous aura of the silver-armored imperial guards, and their cold and merciless attitude, the imperial guards had a cold and merciless attitude. Even if those territorial lords and soldiers were not implicated, they also felt a sense of sympathy. As the relevant news spread throughout Tiandu, more than 40,000 soldiers understood the cause and effect of the matter, as well as the methods of Celestial King and Celestial King Fingyi. For a time, the entire Tiandu was filled with a heavy and oppressive atmosphere. Tens of thousands of soldiers discussed in private, but on the surface they were very silent. Especially when facing Celestial King and his soldiers, they were extremely depressed. In short, the soldiers and the people under Celestial King had formed a very deep estrangement. Although the two sides would not oppose each other for the time being, the gap between the classes was rapidly solidifying. No matter how many methods Celestial King and Celestial King Fingyi used, they could not eliminate it. However, both sides stood on their own standpoints and did not think they were in the wrong. No one would reflect or give in. The suicide of Exan and Deputy Domain Master was, of course, a show put on by Ji Tianxing. He sneaked into Tiandu and possessed Exan and Deputy Domain Master to create conflict and disrupt the situation in Tiandu. When Celestial King Fingyi killed everyone in the pleasure region and captured everyone to be interrogated, his goal had been achieved. Exan and Deputy Domain Master's identity did not have much value. In addition, Celestial King Fingyi had already noticed him and would definitely closely monitor and investigate him. Since that was the case, he might as well add one last flame when the matter had reached its peak and was about to end and calm down. He committed suicide in front of everyone, and before he died he cried out for justice and accused Celestial King and Celestial King Fingyi of their crimes. This resonated with many territorial lords and soldiers. It had to be said that this move was ruthless and the effect was very obvious. Moreover, at that time no one thought that he would do that. No one reacted and no one could stop him. The so-called suicide was actually relatively simple. When he smashed the top of his head with his palm and made a suicidal move, his soul quietly left his body and flew away. As for Exon and Deputy Domain Master's divinity fragment, he kept it and returned it to the head of the corpse. In this way his soul successfully left the body, and Exon and Deputy Domain Master's death was very real and natural. Even if Celestial King and Celestial King Fingy were suspicious, they could not find anything wrong with Exon and Deputy Domain Master's body after the incident. After Ji Tianxing's soul left the square in front of the palace, he temporarily returned to his body and continued to hide in Tiandu to find his next target. As for who the next target would be, that would depend on how the situation developed, and then the most suitable target would be chosen. For the next few days the atmosphere in Tiandu was very strange. A few tens of region lords and their subordinates were still discussing endlessly in secret, and their moods were extremely dejected and annoyed. Although they did not show any intention to resist, they still followed Celestial King and Celestial King Fingy's orders and continued to carry out their mission. However, every time they saw Celestial King's soldiers as well as the silver-armored Imperial Guards, they would be especially cold and indifferent, and there would be a complicated look in their eyes. Even when Celestial King Fingy was investigating the death of Exon and Deputy Domain Master, he noticed this situation and realized that there was a gap between the two sides, and there might be signs of danger. However, the dozens of territorial lords and tens of thousands of soldiers were well behaved and did not make a single mistake, and he could not do anything to change it. After the incident he even reminded Celestial King, but Celestial King did not take it to heart and said coldly, Exon and Deputy Domain Master's suicide incident has caused the soldiers to misunderstand me, and their reaction is normal. You don't have to pay attention to them, they will be fine after a while. Moreover, they are my people and soldiers, so they should obey any orders I give them. Don't tell me that I have to consider their emotions and feelings and counsel them. Celestial King Fingy had nothing to say and could only give up. Even if he was still worried, he could only comfort himself like this. When the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance's army arrived and both sides fought, the attention of the territorial lords and soldiers would be diverted, and they would not worry about this matter anymore. Chapter 43:12. Heaven Capital was peaceful again. Even the situation in the firmament land quieted down without any ripples. Divine Generals Qi, Lu and Lu were still guarding the entrance of the Firmament Domain Chief's mansion with their 6,000 soldiers. They were hiding in the dark, monitoring the movements within a radius of 200,000 miles, waiting for the disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion to show up. The 1,000 disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion were also hiding 200,000 miles away from the entrance of Heaven Capital, waiting for Ji Tianxing's order. Neither side noticed the other. They were waiting for the other to make the first move. The situation was in a stalemate. They couldn't find a breakthrough. The 99 regions of the firmament land were also in a state of peace. Countless people were talking about the situation, feeling anxious for the Celestial King and Kenshin. Didn't the disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion attack the Firmament Domain Chief's mansion? Why didn't they do anything? Moreover, the disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion seemed to have evaporated. They were nowhere to be found. Why were the disciples of the Kenshin and the other four forces still in the illusionary sun-blessed land? Did the Kenshin plan to waste time with the Celestial King? Unfortunately, the Rebel Alliance didn't make any announcement or take any action, no matter how the people, the bigwigs and the experts talked about it. On the other hand, the order to gather people with lofty ideals to join the alliance to suppress the rebels and overthrow the rule of the Nebula God Emperor had come into play. 3 more ancient clans and 4 top forces decided to join the Kenshin after careful consideration. The leaders of these forces were very smart. At first they were in a state of waiting and watching. No matter how powerful the Kenshin was, they wanted to see whether the Kenshin could defeat the Celestial King. In the end, the Celestial King was played by the Kenshin and lost miserably. Now that the 99 regions of the firmament land were occupied, the Celestial King could only hide in Heaven Capital and didn't dare to take the initiative to attack. However, the Kenshin Rebel Alliance only had 5 forces and 5,000 disciples in total. No matter how capable Kenshin was, It was impossible for him to bring 5,000 disciples to attack Tiandu, which was guarded by 50,000 people. Therefore, the current stalemate was within the expectations of many experts. This gave the leaders of the ancient clans and top forces an opportunity. If they chose to side with the Kenshin at this time, they would not have to bear any risks and would even be able to show their usefulness. Even the 5 forces led by the Illusory Sun sect were the first to pledge their allegiance to the Kenshin. But they are taking a big risk. Moreover, the 5 factions had pledged their loyalty to the Kenshin, but they didn't contribute much. In the end, to capture Tiandu and defeat the Celestial King and tens of thousands of troops, they still had to rely on the participation of these latecomers. The rebel alliance would need at least 15,000 people to be able to defeat the tens of thousands of soldiers under the command of the Celestial King under the leadership of Kenshin. From this, it could be seen that in the eyes of countless factions and experts, the Kenshin alone was worth tens of thousands of troops. The 3 ancient clans and 4 top forces all contacted the Illusory Sun sect's leader in advance, hoping that he would help them convey their intentions of pledging their allegiance. The Illusory Sun sect's leader naturally conveyed this to Ji Tianxing, and Ji Tianxing also expressed his agreement and acceptance. Next, the leaders of the 3 ancient clans and 4 top forces should have personally rushed to Illusory Sun Paradise to pledge their allegiance to the Kenshin. However, the Illusory Sun sect's leader rejected the suggestions of those leaders. The leaders of the 7 factions were unhappy and felt a little awkward, thinking, what does the Illusory Sun sect's leader mean? Not letting us pledge our allegiance to the Kenshin face to face, isn't that the same as not wanting us to pledge our allegiance to the Kenshin? The leaders of the 7 factions were somewhat dissatisfied and critical of the Illusory Sun sect's leader. However, they had no way of contacting the Kenshin, and they knew that the Illusory Sun sect's leader was highly regarded by the Kenshin, so they could only contact the Kenshin through him. Therefore, the 7 leaders could only suppress their anger and ask the Illusory Sun sect's leader what was going on. The Illusory Sun sect's leader gave them a brief explanation. The general idea was that the Kenshin and the soldiers were busy carrying out a certain top-secret plan and were unable to receive them. The Kenshin's meaning was that if the leaders were truly loyal, then it was fine for them to pledge their allegiance without meeting each other. The Illusory Sun sect's leader only needed to send the contents of the Heavenly Tao Oath to the 7 leaders through a communication jade slip. Once the 7 leaders read the oath and the oath took effect, the Kenshin would naturally be able to sense it. The Illusory Sun sect's leader's response was very appropriate, and no one could find fault with it. The 7 leaders felt a knot in their hearts and hesitated for a long time, but they still didn't respond. Why can the Illusory Sun sect's leader and those guys from the 10 Directions Pavilion see the Kenshin with their own eyes and swear their allegiance in person? When it's our turn, we can't even see the Kenshin's face and can only swear our allegiance through the air. Could this be the Illusory Sun sect's leader's trick? Is he deliberately obstructing us and not letting us see the Kenshin? The Illusory Sun sect's leader shouldn't have such guts, right? This might be the Kenshin's idea, or maybe they really are carrying out some secret plan. Otherwise, the Kenshin wouldn't have been so quiet for so long. Isn't the Kenshin looking down on us by telling us to swear our allegiance through the air? Then after we join the Rebel Alliance, it'll be very difficult for us to gain their trust and favor, right? But we've already proposed to join the Kenshin. If we go back on our word now, we'll offend the Kenshin. Moreover, the news will leak out and the Celestial King will learn of it. At that time, we won't be able to please either side. We can only advance and not retreat. These thoughts flashed through the minds of almost all the leaders. After weighing the pros and cons, even if they had some regrets in their hearts, they could only agree to swear their allegiance through the air. The matter was thus settled. The Illusory Sun sect's leader gave each of the 7 leaders a heavenly oath. When the 7 leaders saw the contents of the heavenly oath, they were indeed very strict and terrifying, similar to the contents that were circulating in the outside world. Only then did they feel much more at ease. At least, in the matter of the heavenly oath, they were treated the same as the 5 factions of the Illusory Sun sect. There was no difference in treatment. Speaking of which, people were also quite strange. Those who were forced to swear their allegiance would shudder at the strict and detailed heavenly oath and be very resistant to it. And these 7 leaders were actually afraid that the heavenly oath they had to recite would be a simple version. They would rather the contents of the oath be more strict. This way it would show that the Kenshin valued them. Not long after, the 7 leaders recited the heavenly oath and it officially took effect. Ji Tianxing, who was far away in Tiandu, immediately received a response from the heavenly Tao and confirmed that the 7 leaders had sworn their allegiance. The illusory sun sect's leader, who was waiting in the god-slaying worship, finally let out a sigh of relief. At least, the matter of the illusory sun-blessed land being empty could be concealed for the time being. Chapter 43:13. Since everything had calmed down, the stalemate could not be broken for the time being. In that case, only Ji Tianxing could do it himself. After he sneaked into Heaven Capital, his first plan had succeeded. He successfully drove a wedge between the Celestial King's faction and the Territorial Governor's faction, which greatly reduced their loyalty. But it was not enough. It was just a foreshadowing. He carried out his second plan, which was to plunge Heaven Capital into chaos. This time, after a few days of observation and selection, he finally targeted the Territorial Governor of Qingfeng. Qingfeng was located in the center of the firmament continent. It had a large population and rich resources. Therefore, the Territorial Governor of Qingfeng was one of the most powerful among the dozens of territorial governors. Many territorial governors only brought a few hundred guards to Heaven Capital, but he was so powerful that he brought 2,000 divine emperors. Among all the territorial lords, Territorial Lord Qingfeng was the oldest, the strongest, and the most respected. Most importantly, he had more than a dozen territorial governors who were on good terms with him. Among them, 3 of the domain lords had participated in the internal strife, and all 3 of them had been severely punished. For Ji Tianxing's next plan, the identity of the territorial governor of Qingfeng was the most suitable. Of course, the territorial governor of Qingfeng was at the LV7 Divine King realm and had many loyal guards around him. Ji Tianxing wanted to kill and possess the territorial governor of Qingfeng without alerting anyone. He lurked in the dark and waited patiently for 2 days. Finally, he found the right time to act. In an underground secret chamber, Ji Tianxing sneaked in while the territorial governor of Qingfeng was cultivating. He used all his strength to cast spells and multitasking. At the same time, he cast spells to seal the entire secret chamber so that no sound, fluctuation of divine power, or aura could be transmitted out. At the same time, he used his divine skill to capture the awakened territorial governor of Qingfeng. The poor territorial governor of Qingfeng ended his cultivation as quickly as possible. When he opened his eyes, he saw the stranger who had broken into the secret chamber. He could only recognize the handsome young man in a white robe. He seemed to have seen him somewhere before. Before he could recall who this person was, an invisible soul-suppressing divine power had enveloped him. He subconsciously used all his strength to resist the white-robed young man's capture and suppression. Unfortunately, the difference in strength between the 2 sides was too great. If the white-robed youth was a ferocious tiger, then he was a weak and powerless little rabbit. There was no doubt about the outcome. The little white rabbit was pinned down by the tiger's claw, unable to struggle or escape. After being captured and sealed, the territorial lord of Light Wind finally realized who the white-robed young man was. Kenshin. He couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise. His expression immediately changed, revealing an extremely frightened expression. He couldn't believe that Kenshin, who had been dormant for many days, actually came to Tiandu. Moreover, he had even snuck into his secret chamber and wanted to kill him. This was too dreamy. However, Ji Tianxing did not give him a chance to struggle, resist, or beg for mercy. He pressed a finger on Lord Qingfeng's forehead. Violent spiritual energy blasted into Lord Qingfeng's head, shattering his godhead. Ji Tianxing's control of his power was superb. The violent power only shattered Lord Qingfeng's godhead, but did not hurt other parts of his body. Just like that, the realm lord of Clear Wind died before he could call for help. He didn't even have time to scream. Then Ji Tianxing took out his godhead fragment, entered the distorted space-time of Jutian Tenju Tower, and began to refine his spiritual memory. 4 hours had passed in the outside world. Ji Tianxing had been cultivating in the distorted space-time for 8.5 days. He had successfully refined the memories of the realm lord of Light Wind's divine soul, and then possessed his divine body. Just like that, he transformed into the realm lord of Clear Wind. There was no difference or change in his divine body. Even his temperament and eyes were very similar. Even if there was a slight flaw or difference, no one would be able to notice it. After possessing Lord Qingfeng's body, Ji Tianxing did not immediately make a move. In order not to arouse suspicion, he would not take the initiative to stir up trouble or attract hatred. He was waiting. In a few hours early the next morning he would meet up with the other 5 lords to visit his 3 friends. Although the 3 lords had participated in the fight between Shila territory and Exanan territory, they were implicated and punished by Celestial King. The other lords did not dare to provoke them, so they avoided them and were indifferent. But he and the other 5 lords were friends with the 3 unlucky fellows. It had been a few days since the incident. The Celestial King's anger must have subsided. Of course, they would visit the 3 lords to show their loyalty and concern. After all, the Celestial King had made it clear that he did not treat them as human beings. They had to unite to prevent themselves from being manipulated by the Celestial King. Ji Tianxing wanted to use this opportunity to stir up trouble and create more conflicts. A few hours later the sun rose. Ji Tianxing tidied up his appearance, walked out of the secret chamber with the unique gate of Lord Qingfeng, and entered the living room. In the living room, the deputy lord had already prepared a few gifts and told him who each gift was for. Other than the 3 territorial lords who had been punished, there were also a few gifts prepared for the commanders of the Imperial Guards. After all the punished lords and soldiers were temporarily kept in the station under the watch of the silver-armored Imperial Guards. They were not allowed to enter or leave as they pleased. Even though the Celestial King did not mention the word imprisonment, he said that the Imperial Guards would protect the soldiers and allow them to heal in peace. But everyone was well aware that it was imprisonment. The Celestial King was worried about the punished lords and soldiers. He was worried that they would cause trouble and mutiny again, so he sent the Imperial Guards to watch over them. For Ji Tianxing, this was a chance to deepen the conflict and stir up trouble. Soon the other 5 lords arrived one after another. The 2 parties met in the living room and exchanged a few simple words. Then Ji Tianxing led everyone to visit the 3 unlucky fellows. The 6 of them flew across the sky, crossed over a dozen mountains and came to the top of a majestic mountain. There were a few palaces and residences on the peak of the mountain. The first domain lord to be punished and the 500 soldiers under his command lived here. When Ji Tianxing and the other 5 landed outside the palace, the 300 silver-armored Imperial Guards guarding the palace immediately raised their vigilance. The 2 captains of the Imperial Guards hurriedly flew over and shouted with a cold expression, "All territorial lords, please stop. This place is under our watch. It is not advisable to come close. Please leave quickly." Ji Tianxing immediately frowned and asked unhappily, "They have already admitted their guilt and received their punishment. They are in the station to heal their wounds. Why do you need to watch over them? Moreover, when did the Celestial King order them to be imprisoned?" The other 5 lords were also a little angry, but they did not act out. The 2 Imperial Guards captains were too lazy to explain. They again asked them to leave quickly. So the lords quickly smiled and explained that they were here to visit their friends. They asked the Imperial Guards captains to make an exception. While explaining their intentions, the 5 of them also presented generous gifts without leaving a trace. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 43:14. Logically speaking, the territorial lords were all vassals and had great power and status. Compared to them, the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards in front of them were just foot soldiers. Only the commander of the Imperial Guards had the qualifications to sit on the same level as the territorial lords. But in this situation the Imperial Guards had always been arrogant and thought highly of themselves. The few territorial lords could only endure the humiliation, suppress their anger and pretend to please the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards. Not only did they explain their purpose of visit, they also gave them generous gifts. The 2 captains of the Imperial Guards felt their vanity was greatly satisfied when they saw the nobles bowing to them and flattering them with smiles on their faces. After accepting the gifts, they vaguely agreed and allowed Ji Tianxing and the rest to visit their friends. But they could not stay for more than an hour inside. Moreover, if this matter was known by Fingyi and the commander of the Imperial Guards, they would never admit to receiving the gifts. The 5 territorial lords quickly nodded and agreed. Both parties reached a consensus. After Ji Tianxing and the rest entered the palace, the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards kept the gifts and returned to their cold demeanor. The 5 territorial lords who were all smiles just now had a black face and could not help but discuss and curse. 2 damn bastards using a chicken feather as a token of authority, how dare they ride on our heads? Just 2 captains of the Imperial Guards, they do not even have the qualifications to curry favor with us. Now they are so arrogant, too hateful. Aren't they just relying on Fingy and Celestial King's support and looking down on everyone? Celestial King does not care about our lives, and even these Imperial Guards dare to belittle us. They really deserve to die. Brothers, to be honest, I really regret it. I should not have brought the elites and rushed to Tiandu. Sure. Keep your voice down, don't let those bastards hear you. Don't I have the same thoughts? We're the lords of our own territories. If we stay in our own territories, we'll be the supreme lords. We came to Tiandu to work for Celestial King, but even the captains of the Imperial Guards dare to make things difficult for us. Damn it, if Tiandu opens its gates, I will definitely bring the soldiers back to our own territory. Are you confused? Our territorial lord's mansion has been captured and sealed by Kenshin. Can you go back? So what? Maybe I can lead the soldiers to join Kenshin, take back the cave and continue to be the territorial lord, and live a much better life than now. Are you crazy? How dare you say such things? Ji Tianxing sneered endlessly in his heart when he saw the region leaders getting angrier and angrier as they spoke, and the content of their words became more and more outrageous. However, he maintained a serious expression on his face and pretended to cough twice before reminding them, ahem ahem, you guys stop talking nonsense. You're not the only ones who have some ideas. The other dozens of domain lords might have some as well. But the Clear Wind Territorial Lord was the big brother among all the territorial lords and had a high prestige. Since he had spoken, the other domain leaders hurriedly shut their mouths. Then they went to visit the territorial lord who had been punished and was still injured. After they met in the living room, they greeted each other warmly. Ji Tianxing and the other territorial lords took out gifts to express their concern and comfort for the territorial lord who had been punished. Speaking of the previous punishment, the domain lord's mood was still a little resentful. It was obvious that his anger had not yet subsided. He quickly cast a spell to activate the palace's defensive array, isolating it from the outside world's divine senses. Then he vented his anger. Many thanks, brothers and seniors, for coming to visit me. This time I went to support the Happy Realm and seek justice for them. I didn't expect that I would suffer an undeserved calamity. I've been thinking a lot these past few days when I was recuperating. Territorial Lord Qialu and I have been friends for many years, so I must help him when he is in trouble. So even if I was severely punished by the Celestial King, I don't blame Territorial Lord Qialu. I just feel that this is the first time I've seen the Celestial King's true colors in 1,000 years. It's really disappointing. No wonder the Territorial Lord activated the palace's defensive array, isolating it from the outside world. His words were too disgraceful, and he was afraid that the Imperial Guards outside would hear them. Once these words reached the Celestial King's ears, not only would his future be ruined, he might even lose his life. So the other territorial lords' expressions changed slightly, and they looked at each other. Although the other territorial lords felt the same way, Lord Qingfeng had just asked them not to talk about it and not to say it out loud. So the territorial lords kept silent and didn't say anything. The punished territorial lord continued. The conflict between Qialu territory and Xinf territory can be big or small. It's not like there is a deep hatred between them. If the Celestial King took those of us who worked for him seriously, he could have stopped the situation and punished us accordingly. We had 100,000 soldiers before, but now there are only 50,000 left. Logically speaking, the Celestial King should care more about the lives of his soldiers. But we didn't expect Divine King Fingy to be so vicious and ruthless, directly killing everyone in Qialu territory. Speaking of this, he sneered with contempt. Probably in the eyes of the Celestial King and Divine King Fingy, the lives of our soldiers are like grass, like ants. As long as the situation doesn't escalate and doesn't affect the stability of Tiandu, they don't care how many people they kill. You say, the master that we are loyal to and work for actually thinks of us like this. Isn't it ridiculous? I don't care what you think, I just want to say. From now on, my men and I will stay here in seclusion to heal. Even if my injuries are healed, even if Kenshin leads an army into Tiandu, I will never fight again and work for the Celestial King. F***ck loyalty, F***ck achievements. At the end of his speech, the territorial lord cursed angrily. The other territorial lords were also moved. Considering that the palace had a defensive formation, they didn't care about anything and followed suit. Yes, Brother Lin, although we didn't personally experience this, we know the ins and outs of this matter. Overall, we understand your feelings very well. Don't we feel the same as you, disappointed and bitterly disappointed? Sigh. In the past 1,000 years, the firmament continent was peaceful. The celestial king sat firmly on the throne and didn't have to worry about anything. Now that I think about it, his unparalleled wisdom and outstanding scheming deeds were mostly made up and acted out. Anyway, he was the overlord of the continent, everyone would praise him. No matter how great he was praised before, now that he met Kenshin, he immediately returned to his original state. He and Kenshin didn't even meet face to face, and he was casually crushed and trampled by Kenshin. What a useless and cowardly person. The Celestial King is useless and has no strategy, but he is also so cold-blooded and tyrannical. End of chapter. Chapter 43:15. The territorial masters opened their hearts and spoke their minds, unscrupulously slandering the Celestial King. Of course, they felt that what they said was the truth and had no intention of slandering him. Ji Tianxing listened from the side, but he didn't interrupt. His expression remained calm. But in fact he was already laughing in his heart. Obviously his plan to sow discord was very effective. After the territorial masters vented their anger, they felt much better. Especially the territorial master who was punished. Seeing that his friends understood and supported him, and that everyone had the same feeling, his mood suddenly brightened. However, when one of the territorial lords saw that Ji Tianxing was silent, he thought that Ji Tianxing was unhappy. He quickly smiled apologetically and said, "Senior Qingfeng, we're just saying. We don't have any intention of rebelling. Just pretend that you didn't hear anything and don't take it to heart." Hearing him say this, the territorial masters reacted and quickly looked at Ji Tianxing. Seeing Ji Tianxing's expression, they suddenly felt guilty and regretful. They quickly defended themselves. Although they were all friends and stood on the same side, they should have a common enemy and hate the Celestial King. But the territorial masters were worried that the territorial master of Qingfeng was too blindly loyal and could not bear to hear such treacherous words. If the territorial master of Qingfeng's brain went haywire and told the Celestial King, then they would be in trouble. However, Ji Tianxing raised his hand and interrupted them. He smiled and said, "Don't be nervous. I have known you for hundreds of years. Do you still know my nature? Don't forget we are grasshoppers on the same rope. Our position is the same as everyone else's. Isn't what you're saying also what this old man is thinking? But we are in Heaven Capital and under the eyes of the Celestial King. In the future, when we discuss this matter, please be careful to keep it a secret. If you are not absolutely reliable, don't show your rebellious thoughts towards the Celestial King and your close relationship with the Kenshin. Otherwise, the Celestial King will definitely treat us as traitors who have sided with the Kenshin and kill us without hesitation." Hearing the Domain Lord of Clear Wind's earnest words, the other 6 Domain Lords all nodded seriously, indicating that they would listen and pay attention. Even though the phrase closeness to Kenshin startled the domain leaders. They were a little puzzled. We were only criticizing the Celestial King. When did we say we were going to side with the Kenshin? However, everyone understood what the Realm Lord of Clear Wind was trying to say, so they didn't care about this detail. Moreover, if the Celestial King knew that they were discussing this behind their backs, he would definitely treat them as traitors. It would be no different from defecting to the Kenshin. Everyone conversed for an entire hour before leaving one after another. Next, Ji Tianxing led the 5 territorial lords to visit the 2nd territorial lord who had been punished. This territorial lord and his 800 soldiers also lived in a palace and mansion on the peak of a mountain. When Ji Tianxing and the other 5 territorial lords arrived at the peak of the mountain, they saw that there were also 200 imperial guards standing guard outside the palace and mansion. Just as they were about to approach, 2 imperial guard captains came up to them and ordered them to stay back with an indifferent expression. The general situation was the same as before. The 5 territorial lords could only suppress their anger, put on a smiling face, and took out gifts to put in a good word with the 2 imperial guard captains. The 2 imperial guard captains' vanity was satisfied. After accepting the gifts, they allowed the 5 territorial lords to enter. The 5 territorial lords walked in front and Ji Tianqing followed behind. However, just as the 5 territorial lords took 2 steps, Ji Tianqing was stopped by the 2 imperial guard captains. The 2 imperial guard captains looked at Ji Tianqing with a mocking expression and sneered. The commander has ordered that no one is allowed to visit or approach. Please leave. Hearing this, Ji Tianqing immediately frowned and his eyes flashed with deep shame and anger. The 5 territorial lords also stopped and looked at the 2 imperial guard captains in shock. Their brows were full of anger. Obviously, even a fool would understand what was going on. The 5 territorial lords presented gifts and put in a good word with a smiling face, and the imperial guard captains allowed them to enter. However, Ji Tianqing did not present any gifts or put in a good word with a smiling face. As usual, he maintained the posture of a territorial lord, with the temperament of a reserved and arrogant expert. If it was in the past, no one would find anything wrong with it because the territorial lord of Qingfeng had always been like this. However, the situation was different now. The 2 imperial guard captains' vanity was inflated. Seeing that the 5 territorial lords were trying to please them, they naturally could not stand the territorial lord of Qingfeng's arrogance. They took this opportunity to make things difficult for the territorial lord of Qingfeng and embarrass him. The other 5 territorial lords respected the territorial lord of Qingfeng, so naturally, they would not let Ji Tianqing make a fool of himself. They hurriedly argued with the 2 imperial guard captains. Captains, the territorial lord of Qingfeng came with us. We are all here to visit a friend. The territorial lord of Qingfeng is a highly respected senior. Even if God King Fengyi is here, he will have to show some respect. I advise you to make an exception for him. That's right. We have already given you gifts to express our sincerity. The territorial lord of Qingfeng came with us. Captains, you can't humiliate him like this. If it was in the past, the territorial lords would not even bother to pay attention to the 2 imperial guard captains. If such a thing had really happened, the territorial lords would have been angry and even reprimanded them. However, now the territorial lords could only defend themselves, show weakness and plead for leniency. The 2 imperial guard captains became more complacent. They sneered and said, "The 5 of you are reasonable, so we can make an exception. However, the territorial lord of Qingfeng seems to be looking down on us. Don't blame us for enforcing the law impartially." Territorial lords, please think twice before you speak. We are enforcing the law impartially. How can we accept bribes? We only made an exception because of your sincere attitude. After accepting the gifts, the 2 imperial guard captains would definitely not admit to it. Since they had already fallen out with the territorial lord of Qingfeng, they could not show weakness. Naturally, they would make things difficult for the territorial lord and force him to bow down. Unexpectedly, the territorial lord of Qingfeng, who had been upright, plain-spoken and dignified for many years, did not change his character. He flew into a rage on the spot. He glared at the 2 imperial guard captains and scolded them harshly, "Bastards! Don't you know your place and try to blackmail me? You are just 2 imperial guard captains. How dare you behave so arrogantly in front of me? Are you tired of living?" As he scolded them, Ji Tianqing also released the aura of a high-level god king and shrouded the 2 imperial guard captains. The 2 imperial guard captains were only second-degree low-level god kings. They were immediately pushed back by the invisible aura. They took a few steps back and their faces turned pale. They almost fell to the ground. After they steadied themselves, they looked at Ji Tianqing in shock and fear. They revealed an expression of disbelief. They had never expected that the white-bearded old man in front of them would be so unreasonable, stubborn, and rigid. Chapter 43:16. However, the 2 captains were only shocked by Ji Tianqing's aura for a moment before they quickly regained their senses. The fear and astonishment in their hearts dissipated and was replaced by a thick sense of anger and shame. Thinking of the status of the territorial masters in the Celestial King's heart and the Imperial Guards in the Celestial King's eyes, the 2 captains immediately regained their confidence. "Territorial Master of Qingfeng, how dare you insult the Imperial Guards? We are only captains of the Imperial Guards and have a low status. We can tolerate your insults. However, you can't insult the 8,000 Imperial Guards like this. The Imperial Guards are the guards of the Celestial King. You are insulting the Celestial King. Territorial Master of Qingfeng, although your rank is higher than ours, don't forget where you are. This is not your Qingfeng territory. You can't behave atrociously here. The two captains of the Imperial Guards were not stupid. They immediately pinned the accusation of insulting the Imperial Guards and humiliating the Celestial King on Ji Tianxing's head. Ji Tianxing, the fake territorial master of Qingfeng, was a very realistic portrayal of the territorial master of Qingfeng's temperament. He was so angry that his face was ashen and his white beard was trembling. He pointed at the two captains of the Imperial Guards and scolded, "How dare you? You are the ones who extorted and accepted bribes. How dare you be so arrogant when you blackmailed me? Despicable and shameless bastard, you actually dare to frame this old man and frame me with a crime. Today I must find Fingy God King to be the judge. Even if I have to report this to the Celestial King, I will prove my innocence and let the Celestial King punish you two vermin scum." Hearing his words, the two captains of the Imperial Guards were stunned and felt a little guilty. After all, they did accept bribes. Once the matter became serious, the governor of the Imperial Guards would definitely punish them. However, they did not expect this white-bearded old man to be so unreasonable and stubborn. The other 5 domain leaders, seeing that both sides had formed a grudge and that the matter was about to escalate, hurriedly tried to persuade him. "Captains, Lord Qingfeng is a man of virtue and prestige. He has always been upright and unyielding. Even the Celestial King admires him. How can you treat him like this? Senior Qingfeng, please calm down. This is only a small matter, a misunderstanding. There is no need for us to let God King Fengyi know." Yes. Everyone, let's take a step back and pretend nothing happened. Thinking of God King Fengyi's cruel methods, a few of the domain lords shuddered. They quickly acted as mediators to prevent the matter from getting out of hand. Who knew that when the two captains of the Imperial Army saw this situation, they knew that the domain lords were guilty and became more confident. Furthermore, the Celestial King clearly did not care about the lives of these domain masters and soldiers. The Imperial Guards were the direct subordinates of the Celestial King. The Imperial Guards governor and God King Fengyi would protect them. Thinking of this, the two captains of the Imperial Guards puffed out their chests and sneered, "This matter can be big or small. It depends on how Lord Qingfeng views and resolves it. Don't blame us for being merciless. As long as Lord Qingfeng retracts his words and apologizes to us, this matter can be considered over." That's right. When Lord Qingfeng is angry, he scolded us so harshly. No matter what, he should apologize to us. As for the gifts to comfort and compensate us, there's no need for that. We're not greedy people. Logically speaking, as long as Ji Tianxing admitted his mistake and apologized, this matter could be considered over. However, this was an opportunity that Ji Tianxing had purposely planned. How could he let this matter be resolved? If it were the other 5 domain lords, they would have suppressed their anger and humiliation and apologized. However, the 5 domain lords had a bad premonition. They looked at Ji Tianxing nervously. Based on their understanding of Lord Qingfeng, they had guessed that this stubborn senior would not bow down. As they had expected, Ji Tianxing was so angry that he laughed. He pointed at the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards and scolded, "Good. You guys are truly shameless to the extreme. You've really broadened my horizons. You want me to apologize to you 2 bastards? Not even in my next life. This old man has done nothing wrong, so why should I lower my head to you? Do you deserve it? Scums and bastards like you, I will not only scold you but also eradicate you." After scolding, Ji Tianxing unleashed his strength of the 7th King God Realm. He suppressed the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards with his powerful God Realm strength and used his capturing technique to grab them. "Damn it! Are you crazy? How dare you attack us? Have you thought about the consequences?" The 2 captains of the Imperial Guards were startled. They screamed and turned around to run away. Around the palace and the courtyard, the 2 Imperial Guards saw that the situation was not good. They immediately came to help. However, Lord Qingfeng's strength and means were much stronger than the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards. The 2 captains of the Imperial Guards had just run 1,000 zhang away when they were caught by Ji Tianxing. He sealed the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards' God Realm strength with a technique. Then he grabbed the captains of the Imperial Guards, one in each hand, turned around and flew into the sky, heading straight for the capital God Palace. This series of actions were completed in the blink of an eye. It was too fast for the eyes to take in. The 5 protectorate masters were stunned. When they came to their senses, Xianxia had already flown 30,000 li away and disappeared into the horizon. It's over. Go after him. What are you waiting for? Go and get Lord Qingfeng back. Don't let Lord Qingfeng reach the capital god palace. Otherwise things will get out of hand. We are already estranged from the Celestial King's subordinates. Lord Qingfeng is forcing the Celestial King to make a choice. What choice? In the eyes of the Celestial King, we are not as important as the Imperial Guards. There's no need to guess. We are the unlucky ones. The 5 protectorate masters turned pale with fright. They anxiously flew into the sky and chased after Xianxia. While they were hurrying, the 5 of them were still discussing telepathically. They were very anxious. However, they were only worried about their own situation. No one blamed Lord Qingfeng for being too impulsive. This was because everyone knew that the territorial lord of Clear Wind had always been like this. He had never changed. Moreover, this matter was caused by the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards who had deliberately stirred up trouble. Given Lord Qingfeng's temperament, it would be strange if he could bear the humiliation and admit his mistake. Xianxia carried the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards as if he were carrying chickens. Along the way, many Imperial Guards, protectorate masters and soldiers witnessed this. The 2 captains of the Imperial Guards were so humiliated that they wanted to commit suicide. On the other hand, Xianxia's murderous aura and uncontrollable rage caused countless people to speculate and discuss. Immediately after, the 5 region lords also hurriedly caught up and chased after Xianxia without regard for anything else. This scene quickly spread and incited endless discussion among tens of thousands of soldiers. Heaven Capital, which had finally calmed down, was once again bustling with noise and excitement. After the previous conflict, the Protectorate Masters and the Celestial King's subordinates had long been estranged. And now, Lord Qingfeng had captured 2 captains of the Imperial Guards. Everyone had a premonition that this matter would blow up and the 2 sides would definitely break off. Chapter 43:17. Dutian Deity Palace was the most sacred and majestic palace in Tiandu. It was the palace where officials discussed matters and also the residence of the Celestial King. At this moment, Feng Yi was busy elsewhere and the Celestial King was handling official business in his study. Only 2 commanders of the Imperial Army were guarding Dutian Deity Palace with nearly 1,000 Imperial Guards. Seeing Xianxia carrying 2 captains of the Imperial Army and flying over at lightning speed, the Imperial Army commander and the rest of the Imperial Army were dumbfounded. Everyone didn't understand what was going on. What was going on? They had not heard of anything major happening in Tiandu. Why would the territorial governor of Qingfeng capture 2 captains of the Imperial Army and rush to Dutian Deity Palace with a murderous aura? Looking at his posture, was he here to denounce him? But why would the 2 captains of the Imperial Army offend him? Filled with doubts, the 2 commanders of the Imperial Army went up and stopped the territorial governor. Cool breeze, Territorial Lord, please wait. Territorial Lord Qingfeng, where are you going with my 2 subordinates? The commanders of the Imperial Army were of a higher status than the captains of the Imperial Army. Even in the past, the commanders of the Imperial Army were qualified to talk to the territorial governor. Their status was only half a level lower. Naturally, Xianxia wouldn't reveal any flaws. He immediately slowed down and said angrily, "These 2 bastards broke the law and blackmailed me, yet they still dare to be so arrogant. How can I let them go?" The reason he came to the capital deity palace was naturally to find the deity king and the Imperial Guard governor to reason things out. What are you waiting for? Go and report to them. The 2 commanders of the Imperial Army were dumbfounded and looked at the 2 captains of the Imperial Army in confusion. In their opinion, even if the Imperial Guards were arrogant, they would not be so arrogant as to blackmail the territorial governor of Qingfeng. How could the 2 captains of the Imperial Army admit their wrongdoings when they saw their backer? The 2 of them hurriedly shouted that they had been wronged. "Lord Commander, we were wrongly accused. The territorial governor is slandering us. He is framing us. There is a misunderstanding. It was the other domain leaders who coerced us into breaking the rules. We refused to do so, and that's why old Qingfeng was so angry." The two commanders of the imperial army heaved a sigh of relief when they realized there was a story behind this. The two of them hurriedly stopped the Lord of Qingfeng and said with a fake smile, "Please calm down, Lord of Qingfeng. The cause and process of this matter have yet to be verified. You are hurting the dignity of the imperial guards by carrying our subordinates like this. Let them go first." Region Lord Qingfeng, this is the capital God Palace. Please give the imperial guards some face and don't make things too ugly. Otherwise, no one will be able to bear the responsibility if the divine king is angered. Since the two imperial army marshals had said that, if it were a normal prefecture lord, he would not continue to pester them. Territorial governor was. He was a righteous and upright role model who was not afraid of power. How could he be scared? You two stop putting on airs in front of this old man. This old man didn't come here today to talk nonsense with you. Get out of my way. I am going to find the commander of the imperial army and the divine king. Ji Tianxing scolded the two commanders of the imperial army and was about to break into the main hall with the two captains of the imperial army. Seeing that the two commanders of the imperial army were blocking his way and would not let him pass, he was enraged. He released a terrifying killing intent that swept toward the two commanders of the imperial army. Get out of my way. Ji Tianxing sent the two commanders of the imperial army flying with his majestic divine power. He carried the two captains of the imperial army and barged into the main hall of the imperial army. When the two commanders of the imperial army regained their balance and regained their senses, they were furious and wanted to call for someone to stop Ji Tianxing. However, Ji Tianxing had already rushed into the main hall and shouted loudly for divine King Fengyi, the commander of the imperial army, and the celestial king to uphold justice. The two commanders of the imperial army rushed into the main hall but could not do anything. As for the imperial guards who had heard the news and wanted to capture the territorial lord of Lightwind, they were also dumbfounded. They stood there in a daze not knowing what to do. Soon after, the 5 territorial lords arrived as fast as lightning. They did not dare to be as domineering as the territorial governor of the imperial army and divine King Fengyi. After being stopped by the two commanders of the imperial army, they did not dare to force their way in. They quickly explained to the two commanders of the imperial army and pleaded for leniency. Unfortunately, the situation had developed to this stage and was no longer within the control of the two commanders of the imperial army. In a short while, divine King Fengyi brought a few divine generals and the commander of the imperial army to the main hall. Before they could ask Ji Tianxing what had happened, the commander of the imperial army was startled. The celestial king was also alarmed and came to the main hall. Now, with so many experts gathered in the main hall, the situation had become serious and there was no turning back. It had reached a point where it had to be resolved. The celestial king sat at the head of the table with a cold expression. He looked down at the people in the main hall and his eyebrows were furrowed with anger. He only wanted the soldiers under his command to calm down, unite as one and focus on preparing for battle. Never had he imagined that these region lords would repeatedly cause trouble, and it caused him to be extremely displeased and furious. Ji Tianxing, the two captains of the imperial army, and the 5 territorial governors were all involved. They could only stand in the middle of the main hall and wait for the celestial king's judgment. Divine King Fengyi, the commander of the imperial army, and a few divine generals stood on both sides of the main hall and watched the situation develop. Territorial governor of the imperial army, why don't you tell me how this happened? The celestial king looked at Ji Tianxing expressionlessly and asked in a deep voice. After all, the status of the territorial governor of the imperial army was much higher than that of the two captains of the imperial army. Even if the celestial king was biased towards his own subordinates, he could not be too obvious about it. Of course, he had to consider the feelings of the territorial governors. Ji Tianxing made some slight changes to the story and told it to everyone. His story was 90% true and 1 lie. Even the two captains of the imperial army did not find anything wrong with it. However, they did not feel comfortable and felt that something was not right. As for the bystanders, divine King Fengyi, the commander of the imperial army, and a few divine generals, they understood the meaning behind Ji Tianxing's words. He was clearly saying that the imperial army was too arrogant. A mere captain of the imperial army dared to make things difficult for the territorial governors. He even dared to extort and blackmail them. He was really lawless. If the Celestial King did not punish and discipline the imperial army, it would be difficult for the imperial army and the territorial governors to work together in the future. Ji Tianxing's words made the Celestial King even more unhappy and angry. He had enough reason to suspect that the territorial governor of the imperial army was using this as an excuse to sow discord. However, it had happened. Given the status and experience of the territorial governor of the imperial army, there was no way he would let this matter rest after being humiliated and made things difficult for him. Therefore, he had to give a reasonable judgment to resolve the conflict between the two sides. Chapter 43:18. After asking Ji Tianxing, God King Empyrean seemed to have no intention of questioning the two captains. The two captains were too lowly in status. They were intimidated by the Celestial King's authority and did not dare to speak. The governor was a little anxious and quickly signaled the two captains with his eyes. The two captains immediately understood what he meant and were emboldened. They immediately complained to the Celestial King. "Your Excellency, we are innocent. You can't just listen to the Lord of Qingfeng's side of the story. Your Excellency, please understand. We are lowly people. How could we dare to make things difficult for the lords? They forced us to violate the rules and failed to coerce us. That's why they flew into a rage out of humiliation and slandered us." The two captains cried their innocence. The Celestial King saw that there was more to the story and immediately became spirited. He ordered sternly, "The two of you should think carefully about the truth of the matter. Think carefully before you speak. The Lord of Qingfeng is a person of virtue and prestige. He is not someone you can casually criticize." On the surface, it seemed that he was reprimanding the two captains and telling them not to slander the Lord of Qingfeng. But in reality, everyone understood the subtext. The two captains were no longer afraid and hurriedly defended themselves. "Your Excellency, we were ordered by the governor to guard the Sunrise Peak and protect the palace and mansion to prevent the injured soldiers from being disturbed. However, the 6 lords insisted on barging in. We strongly disagreed, so they used both the carrot and the stick to threaten and force us to accept the gifts. Although the lords are of high status and we dare not offend them, we could not let down the governor's trust and cultivation. We were determined not to violate the rules. Therefore we insisted on not allowing the lords to enter. This angered the Lord of Qingfeng. He thought that we disrespected him and humiliated him." Hearing the two captains' sophistry, the governor heaved a sigh of relief and his eyes calmed down. God King Fengyi was also expressionless. He had already guessed the answer and result. The other 5 lords were not convinced and hurriedly explained the truth of the matter. However, the Celestial King did not want to listen to them anymore. He waved his hand and interrupted the leaders. He said in a dignified tone, "All right, all of you, shut up. I've already figured out the ins and outs of the matter. It was my idea to send the Imperial Guards to guard those mountains. You want to visit your friends, this is a moral act, there is nothing wrong with that. But why didn't you ask for my permission? They acted without permission and even used bribery and coercion to force the Imperial Guards to let them go against the rules. You knowingly broke the law. Have you ever put me in your eyes? Have you ever taken the laws laid down by His Majesty the God Emperor to heart?" The Celestial King reprimanded Ji Tianxing and the 5 area masters. Then he turned to the 2 captains of the Imperial Army and said, "Although you were following orders and did stop the area masters from breaking in, your will was not strong enough. You were still threatened by their identity. This is blasphemy against the rules of the Imperial Army. The fact that you accepted the other party's gift is also an irrefutable fact. I'll temporarily strip you of your positions and demote you to ordinary Imperial Guards. You will continue to be soldiers and learn the law and rules well. Do you have any objections?" The 2 captains of the Imperial Army were stunned. Their hearts were filled with panic and anxiety. It took them 100 years to climb from ordinary soldiers to the position of captains. They did not expect that because of this small matter, their captains' positions would be taken away. Of course, the 2 of them objected to this result and wanted the Imperial Army governor to plead for them. However, when they saw the expression and eyes of the Imperial Army governor, they knew that the governor was satisfied with this result and would not plead for them. Therefore, the 2 captains of the Imperial Army could only bow and accept the order and thank the Celestial King for not killing them. After the 2 captains of the Imperial Army left, The Celestial King looked at Ji Tianxing and the 5 area masters. With a dignified expression he ordered, "As area masters, the 6 of you ignored the rules set by me and His Majesty the God Emperor. You have disappointed me. This time I won't punish you. I'll punish you to hand over your military power and stay in the encampment to recuperate and reflect on your mistakes." God King Fingyi and the Imperial Army Governor expressed their satisfaction and support for this punishment. They quickly agreed. However, the expressions of Ji Tianxing and the 5 area masters became very ugly. Their eyes were filled with anger. Indeed, the Celestial King had learned to be smart. He did not punish the area masters and soldiers like last time. This was because he knew that punishing the area masters and soldiers would not make them repent. Instead, it would make them hate him and bear resentment. Moreover, after being punished, the soldiers would not be able to participate in the battle. This would undoubtedly weaken the fighting power of his side. Now, the Celestial King had taken away the military power of the 6 area masters and taken over the 4,000 soldiers under their command. This would not weaken the fighting power of his side. At the same time, the 6 area masters were punished to reflect on their mistakes. At the appropriate time, they could be sent to the battlefield to kill the enemy and redeem themselves. Most importantly, the Celestial King believed that most of the soldiers would not have any resentment. However, the Celestial King thought that his methods were brilliant and that his punishment was very reasonable. The 6 area masters would definitely swallow their anger and obediently hand over their military power. Unfortunately, the area master of Qingfeng showed his usual tough and upright nature. He immediately retorted, "Your Majesty the Celestial King, this old man does not accept your punishment. This matter was originally caused by the Imperial Army's arrogance and despotism. They unscrupulously made things difficult for this old man and the area masters. We respected you and came to confront and judge you in court. I did not expect that in the end, you would still shield the Imperial Army and punish us severely. But this old man has been loyal to His Majesty the God Emperor all my life. I have great respect for you and His Majesty the God Emperor. I did not expect that I would end up like this. This old man also did not expect that in your heart, my position and that of the area masters are not worth mentioning." As soon as these words came out, the entire hall was shocked. Not only Feng Yi and the governor of the Imperial Army were shocked, but even the 5 area masters were looking at him in disbelief. No one had expected that the area master of Qingfeng would be so stubborn and reckless that he dared to say these words in front of the Celestial King. This kind of rebellious words which contained antonyms, was enough to just think about it. How could he say it out loud? The Celestial King was also stunned for a moment. When he came to his senses, he was furious. He sternly rebuked, "Area Master of Qingfeng, how dare you? What? Are you taking advantage of your seniority to betray me and His Majesty the God Emperor?" Ji Tianxing shook his head in disappointment and said with a cold smile, "Justice is in everyone's heart. Since you are unfair and selfish, don't blame your soldiers for being resentful. You're the leader and I'm just a subordinate. You can give me whatever crime you want to commit. As for the military power, you only need to give an order to take it away. Why do you have to direct and act out such a clumsy show? Forget it, this old man is disheartened. Please allow me to go back and reflect on my mistakes." You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.